Yeah, I'll have you lead us in the pledge here. Subcommittee will come to order without objection. The chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. We welcome everyone to today's hearing. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Florida to lead us all in the Pledge of Allegiance. Kat, can you handle that?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I thank the lady for leading us. Without objection, Mr. Roy will be permitted to participate in this hearing. The chair now recognizes himself for an opening statement. On the third day of this administration, January 23rd, 2021, the White House sent an email to Twitter. The email said this: wanted to flag the below tweet, and I'm wondering if we can get moving on the process for having it removed ASAP, in all caps. That third day, what did that tweet say? Tweet from Mr. Kennedy said this: Hank Aaron's tragic death is part of a wave of suspicious deaths among elderly closely following administration of the vaccine. He received the vaccine on January 5th to inspire other Black Americans to get the vaccine. Now, what's interesting about the email that the White House sent to Twitter is the subject line says, flagging Hank Aaron misinformation. Now, misinformation is when you don't have the facts right. You're saying things that aren't true. But when you look at Mr. Kennedy's tweet, there was nothing in there that was factually inaccurate. Hank Aaron, real person, great American, passed away after he got the vaccine, just pointing out facts. And yet the White House, on the third day, was trying, actually, 1:04 a.m. on January 23rd, 2021, 37 hours into the administration, they were trying to censor Mr. Kennedy. I find that interesting, the irony here, trying to censor the guy who's actually their Democrat primary opponent. Go figure. 3 months earlier, the FBI helped censor our second witness, Miss Morris's story. Her story in the New York Post about emails on the Hunter Biden laptop. And we know the FBI censored her because of work this committee has done to uncover what happened, and because of our third witness, Mr. Sauer, the lawsuit that he argued on behalf of Louisiana and Missouri in federal court, in a case that they got the amazing ruling from on July 4th, just 2 weeks ago. You go back to, in the course of that investigation, course of that lawsuit from Missouri and Louisiana, Yoel Roth, former head of site integrity at Twitter, in his sworn declarations, it's brought out in that lawsuit, in his sworn declaration in front of the Federal Elections Commission, he said this: during weekly meetings, federal law enforcement agencies communicated that they expected hack and leak operations before the 2020 presidential election, likely in October. These expectations were discussed throughout 2020. I also learned in these meetings that a hack and leak operation would involve Hunter Biden. Now think about it. Weekly meetings throughout 2020, hack and leak operation in October involving Hunter Biden. 5 key things they pointed out throughout that year. And guess what? It all happens. It happens just like they predicted. How did they know? How did they know it was going to happen like that? Because they had the laptop. They had the laptop for 10 months before Miss Morris's story on October 14th. Her story breaks that day. That same day, October 14th, 2020, Twitter meets with the FBI, specifically the Foreign Influence Task Force at the FBI. Later that same day, again, the day her story comes out, Facebook also meets with the FBI. The head of the Foreign Influence Task Force now is Laura Demlow, and this committee interviewed her just 3 days ago. And what an interesting interview that was. We asked her about these meetings. She stated in the first meeting, the FBI and Twitter, in that first meeting, she said, someone from Twitter asked, is the laptop real? They asked the fundamental question. That story broke. It was big news. Twitter asked the FBI. They're right there in front of them. They've been prepping them for a year. They asked the FBI, is the laptop real? Ms. Demlow conveyed to the committee this week, an FBI agent answered, yes, it is. Another FBI agent A lawyer very quickly followed up with no further comment. So again, here's the scenario. The story breaks. Twitter's meeting with FBI later that same day. Someone from Twitter asks, is this story real? Is the laptop real? The FBI answers yes, and then quickly followed by, again, all this conveyed by Ms. Demlow, the FBI lawyer says no further comment. In the later meeting with Facebook, again that same day, the FBI was asked the same question, and this time, the FBI gets their story straight. Ms. Demlow is the only one who comments, and she says no comment. Obviously, by the second meeting, the FBI had coordinated, and she conveyed this in her deposition, that they had deliberated what they were going to respond when that question was asked. So think about this. After being repeatedly told a hack and leak Russian info operation is coming for a whole year, it arrives on October 14th in the form of Ms. Morris's story, an accurate story. Our government knows the laptop is real. They know it's not a Russian information op, and they know the story is true. But when directly asked, they say no comment. And of course, Ms. Morris's story is censored. Visibility filtered, the term that the tech companies use. No, you can't direct message, you can't send it. Keeping the American people from valuable information just days before the most important election we have, election for commander-in-chief, election for the presidency of the United States. That's why Ms. Morris is here today. She knows what it's like to be censored. It's why Louisiana and Missouri filed the case. It's why Mr. Sauer argued the case. And frankly, it's why Mr. Kennedy is running for president. It's to stop. Help us expose and stop what's going on. This alliance, big government pressuring private entities to censor Americans. I think in Ms. Morris's testimony, which I read this morning, big tech, big government working together, big media working all together to censor American speech. So we look forward to your testimony over the next few hours. But I will tell you this, just get ready. I think these guys, Ms. Morris, get ready. Last time we had a journalist sitting there, they were trying to get them to divulge their sources. So be ready, but I know you can handle it. We appreciate your willingness to come forward. We appreciate your willingness to fight for the First Amendment. With that, I yield to the ranking member for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning to everyone. Just have some administrative matters first. I wanted to introduce into the record page 55 from the committee's interview with FBI employee Roya Demlow, who you just spoke about, which took place on July 17, 2023. In that line, she says, the question was asked, okay, if someone were to leave here today, were to leave this interview and were to suggest or imply that when you said the laptop was real, that it meant that the FBI had affirmatively determined in October 2020 that the laptop belonged to Hunter Biden, that the contents belonged to Hunter Biden, and that the contents had not been manipulated in some way, would they be representing what you said, correct? Answer by Ms. Demlow. They would be representing what I said because I don't have much knowledge of that. They would be misrepresenting what I said because I don't have much knowledge of that. Because this committee likes to misrepresent or leave off complete sentences of what individuals said, I'd like to introduce this into the record at this time. Thank you. And as to no comment by an FBI, that's usually what they say when there's an ongoing investigation, particularly when it's a couple of days before an election. But why are we here? Why? You know, that's been the question that quite a number of people have been asking me. Why are you having this hearing? What does this have to do with inflation? What does this have to do with the cost of living? What does this have to do with the everyday lives of Americans, the thing that the Republican Party said that they would focus on if they had control of the House? Why would the Republican leadership and the committee majority give a hearing and a platform to the witnesses today, specifically to Mr. Kennedy, a man who has recently claimed that COVID-19 is targeted to attack Caucasians and Black people? The people who are most immune are Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese. And before that, in his film, Medical Racism, The New Apartheid, that film stated that COVID-19 vaccines do not work for Black children because of their, quote, kick-ass kind of immune system, that hyper, superhuman, subhuman kind of language. He also said, even in Hitler's Germany, you could cross the Alps to Switzerland. You could hide in an attic like Anne Frank did to imply Jews in Nazi Germany had more freedoms than unvaccinated Americans during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, many of my Republican colleagues across the dais will rush to cover that they have Mr. Kennedy here because they want to protect his free speech, that they do not believe in American censorship. This is not the kind of free speech that I know of, the free speech that is protected by the Constitution's First Amendment. But free speech is not an absolute. The Supreme Court has stated that. And others' free speech that is allowed, hateful, abusive rhetoric, does not need to be promoted in the halls of the people's house. This Republican charge of free speech is being used by Republican members to promote quasi-science, things such as the replacement theory that says that brown people are replacing good white Americans here in this country. Let's not remember that this country first belonged to brown Native American people. It's a rallying cry for bigotry and hate. There are members of the Republican conference who also frequently suggest that Americans have to deal with COVID rules as the same as oppression of Nazi Germany. Indeed, some have even questioned whether the Holocaust took place. We have staffers who openly follow white supremacy without any condemnation of the Republican conference. Some give it chuckles, slaps on the back, shrugs, all under the mantra of free speech. It's a free country. You absolutely have a right to say what you believe, but you don't have the right to a platform, public or private. We don't have to give one of the largest platforms of our democracy, Congress, this hearing. Our right does not mean that we as Americans are not free from accountability. And that's what's distressing about this hearing. Even knowing what they know about Mr. Kennedy's hateful, evidence-free rhetoric, and even though they've invited any number of witnesses to make their point, Speaker McCarthy, Chairman Jordan affirmatively chose to give this a platform. They intentionally chose to elevate this rhetoric to give these harmful, dangerous views a platform in the halls of the United States Congress. That's endorsing that speech. That's not just supporting free speech. They have co-signed on idiotic, bigoted messaging. It's a conscious choice. There's no doubt as to why they're making the choice. It's not to guard free speech or to ensure equality for all. All of this, as you'll hear throughout this hearing, is to show us by their conduct over and over and again that any attack on Joe Biden to get Donald Trump back in the White House is what they need to do. They think that by hurting the Biden administration, by putting Mr. Kennedy on display, they have said that he's only running for censorship. I think people run for the President of the United States because they want to advance the American people. Over the last 8 months, the extreme MAGA majority has spent its time, not to mention tons of taxpayer money, something that they're always so cautious about, on baseless investigations that have gone nowhere, all in an effort to serve as a legislative arm of the Trump campaign and discredit any agency that dares to hold the president or those that work with him or who have the same ideals that he has accountable for those that are such as white supremacy, such as election deniers, such as inciters and those who engaged in the riots of January 6th. Truth be told, I have no idea whether the chairman actually believes any of the stuff. I don't. It's not a question I've asked him or one that's necessarily even important. But it's clear that one aim of his investigation is to bully tech and media companies into turning a blind eye to right-wing extremist conspiracies, from QAnon to the Great Replacement theory, as they spread across their platforms, even when those theories violate very basic terms of service about deliberate disinformation and promoting violence. Let's not even think about what happens in 2024 with Russian trolls, Iran, China trying to interfere in our elections. And the bullying extends far beyond tech companies. Witness after witness have testified to the treatment they received from Chairman Jordan and his team. One of our earliest witnesses, Nina Jankovic, told the committee about receiving thousands of death threats and being told to go into hiding while she was pregnant with her first child, after Chairman Jordan first posted a doctored video of her. When Politico asked Mr. Chairman Jordan about the threats, his office responded, "She deserves to be held accountable." Anyone who doesn't agree with their point of view deserves whatever hatred and threats are thrown at them. Now, I'm across the hall from Mr. Jordan, and several months ago, I saw somebody who seemed to be threatening to his office, and the Capitol Police were moving them away. And I was grateful that they were doing that, because I don't want anyone to harm him or his staff for their rhetoric, for the things that they say. That's inappropriate. That's unconscionable. Another witness, this one a current member of federal law enforcement who spent years protecting Americans from harm, described receiving threatening mail not just to her work office, but to her home address. Someone out there has figured out where this person lives and is targeting them based on disinformation this committee itself spread. She summed it up in a single sentence, "I'm frankly scared." And why does the chairman send this movement to intimidate witnesses? To change their behavior, of course, to make it less safe for law enforcement officers to enforce the law, and less likely that researchers and companies will combat the spread of hate and violence online. One witness, an academic whose organization helped identify disinformation threats to election processes and procedures, described the threats sent to him and his family in detail. When the Republican staff asked him if he would consider performing the same research for 2024 elections, he said, quote, "Since this investigation has cost the university now approaching 7 figures in legal fees, it's been pretty successful, I think, in discouraging us from making it worthwhile for us to do a study for 2024. Another witness, a researcher who analyzed massive data sets to assess the way that rumors spread online, was explicit and personal about the effect of the threats on her life. I mean, quite frankly, I don't have kids, and if I did, I would no longer be doing this work. I'm worried about my students. I know they're worried about doing this kind of work because of these kinds of threats and what they see that I'm going through. And at the same time, I just think the work is so important, and I want to make sure it keeps going. So I don't want to step off that stage. I think we have like special skills that can be really useful and helpful and help our country grow stronger. And this is having a chilling effect. And it's not just me. Other researchers are experiencing the same thing. These are the fruits of this committee's majority investigations. If MAGA Republicans agree with you, you're given a platform to spread any conspiracy theories, no matter how harmful. And if they disagree with you, you get death threats until you have to go away. These folks have a plan. They want to force social media companies to promote conspiracy theories because they think that's the only way their candidate can win the 2024 election. They want to bully the experts into abandoning their work on disinformation to pave the way. They want to give expression to the most vile sorts of speech here in this committee room because it prepares the ground for their own conspiracy theories and pseudoscience. And they apparently don't care how many people are hurt or die as a consequence of their actions, either through lies about vaccines or threats to the safety of witnesses, because nothing is more important to them than power. It's a free country. Both Chairman Jordan and Mr. Kennedy are free to say whatever they want. It's the chairman's right to promote any of the views he wants to promote. But that freedom doesn't mean that the rest of us can't see what they're doing and demand something better from our representatives, from my colleagues, from this Congress. Be better than the witnesses, my colleagues. Let's be better. Let's get about the business, the real business of the American people, and stop the division, the divisiveness that is being promoted through this committee. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. I would ask unanimous consent to enter into the record from page 29 of Ms. Demelow's testimony from 3 days ago. Question, do you recall whether any of these social media companies you were meeting with asked you any questions about the laptop story? I do was her answer. And what is your recollection? Somebody from Twitter essentially asked whether the laptop was real, and one of the FBI folks who was on the call did confirm that, quote, yes, it was, before another participant jumped in and said no further comment. Question, do you recall who from the FBI said it was real? I do. And who was that person? I'll have to get back with you. Without objection, we'll enter that into the record. We now want to introduce our witnesses. I want to start with Ms. Emma Jo Morris. Ms. Morris is politics editor at Breitbart News. She previously served as the deputy politics editor at the New York Post, where she authored the Post coverage of the Hunter Biden laptop and its contents in 2020. Ms. Maya Wiley is the president and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. She previously served as counsel to New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio and at the American Civil Liberties Union and the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. We welcome you as well, Ms. Wiley. Mr. John Sauer is the Special Assistant Attorney General for the Louisiana Department of Justice, and he is one of the lead lawyers in the Missouri v. Biden case that I referenced in my opening statement. He previously served as Deputy Attorney General for special litigation with the Missouri Attorney General's Office and Solicitor General of Missouri. He clerked for Judge Michael Ludig and Justice Antonin Scalia. And then our final witness is Mr. Kennedy. I will turn to our colleague, Mr. Roy, member of the Judiciary Committee, and waved on to the subcommittee to introduce Mr. Kennedy.
Thank you, Chairman. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is the son of former Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy and the nephew of America's 35th President, John F. Kennedy. The third of 11 children, he graduated from Harvard University. We won't hold that against him because he went on to receive his law degree from the University of Virginia School of Law, my alma mater, as an undergraduate. Some viewing Mr. Kennedy through his last name, but that does a tremendous disservice to his life's work, whether you agree with it or not. Out of law school, Mr. Kennedy built his career as an environmental lawyer, representing New York City environmentalists and environmentalists across the globe in numerous legal battles. His work culminated in the landmark New York City watershed agreement focused on the cleaning of New York City's waterways. After the 2008 election, Politico reported that President-elect Obama strongly considered Mr. Kennedy to head the Environmental Protection Agency. He went on to found Children's Health Defense, a national organization intended to address childhood chronic disease and toxic exposures. I assume that being a father of 7, in addition to being one of 11 children himself, fuels his interest in children's health. Following the 2016 election, Mr. Kennedy met with then-President-elect Trump to discuss his potential for a committee to examine vaccine safety and scientific integrity. Their conversation also touched on the CDC and ways to increase independence from financial conflicts. Most recently, Mr. Kennedy announced his campaign for President of the United States. During his campaign announcement, he stated, quote, "My mission over the next 18 months of this campaign and throughout my presidency will be to end the corrupt merger of state and corporate power that is threatening to impose a new kind of corporate feudalism in our country," end quote. It is for this that Mr. Kennedy finds himself receiving the scorn of both the political left and right. Because if one dares challenge the orthodoxy of the powers that be, then one is their enemy. As a graduate of the University of Virginia, Mr. Kennedy no doubt knows the following quote, For here we are not afraid to follow truth wherever it may lead." Thomas Jefferson. That truism was lost during the COVID pandemic. Individuals receiving scorn simply for asking questions, people being silenced for challenging the status quo. These are the kinds of questions that should have been publicly debated, and this hearing is focused on that truth, and we welcome Mr. Kennedy.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Kennedy, we're glad you were here. We will now proceed with the open statement. Before I do, I want to introduce the guy sitting behind you, Mr. Kennedy, who was a former colleague of ours, and maybe more importantly for me, a good friend of mine, Dennis Kucinich, who served in the United States Congress for 14 years, I believe, and great Buckeye. So we welcome Dennis, and I know Elizabeth's here as well, and we appreciate your service, Dennis, and your commitment to the First Amendment. We'll now go with opening testimony. Mr. Kennedy, you are recognized for your opening statement. As mine's not. Make sure it's on.
Mr. Chairman, are you going to swear in the witnesses?
If you'll please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information and belief, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witness answered in the affirmative. Thank you. You may be seated. Mr. Kennedy, you are now recognized for your opening statement, and then we'll go right down the line. He's going to go a little longer.
Excuse me, point of order. I know that witnesses usually have 5 minutes. I see 10 minutes on the board. Is it going to be 10 minutes
We'll
for
give him
every
5
witness?
minutes, but we're pretty lax with this. We'll let him go for
We are?
a little, yeah.
I've seen you gavel down on quite a number of
We've
witnesses.
given senators and former Democrat members of Congress and all kinds
He's
of folks plenty
neither.
of time.
He's
Yeah.
neither.
I'm just saying in past history.
Okay,
in
okay.
committee. But
Let's just watch
you,
the time for all the witnesses.
and if
then.
you want to cut him off and censor him some more, you're welcome to do it.
Oh, that's not my job. That's your job. Why don't you threaten a witness so that they can not want to be a
Mr.
witness?
Kennedy is recognized for his opening statement. We'll give him 5 minutes, more or less, and then we'll move to the next one. Mr. Kennedy, go right ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, maybe we could put 5 minutes on the clock then, not 10.
Could we put 5 on the clock and we'll start it running?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to put aside my written statement for a moment and address one of the points that was brought up, I think an important point by the ranking member, that this body ought to be concerning itself with with issues that impact directly the American people. The rising price of groceries, 76% over the past 2 years for basic foodstuff, the war in Ukraine, the inflation issues, the border issues, many, many other issues that concern us all as a nation. We can't do that without the First Amendment, without debate. When I gave my speech, my announcement speech in Boston 2 months ago, YouTube, I talked about all those issues. I focused on grocery. I focused on the fact that working class people can no longer afford to live in this country. I talked about inflation, all the issues that deeply concern you and that you've devoted your career to alleviating those issues. 5 minutes into my speech, when I was talking about Paul Revere, YouTube deplatformed me. I didn't talk about vaccines in that speech. I didn't talk about anything that was a verboten subject. I just was talking about my campaign and things, the conversation that we ought to be having with each other as Americans. But I was shut down, and that is why the First Amendment's important. Debate, congenial, respectful debate is the fertilizer, it's the water, it's the sunlight for our democracy. We need to be talking to each other. Now, this is a letter that many of you signed, many of my fellow Democrats. I've spent my life in this party. I've devoted my life to the values of this party. This 102 people signed this. This itself is evidence of the problem that this hearing was convened to address. This is an attempt to censor a censorship hearing. The charges in this, and by the way, censorship is antithetical to our party. It was appalling to my father, to my uncle, to FDR, to Harry Truman, to Thomas Jefferson, as the chairman referred to. It is the basis for democracy. It sets us apart from all of the previous forms of government. We need to be able to talk, and the First Amendment was not written for easy speech. It was written for the speech that nobody likes you for. And I was censored not just by the Democratic administration, I was censored by the Trump administration. I was the first person censored by as the chairman pointed out, by the Biden administration 2 days after it came into office. It ordered a truthful, and by the way, they had to invent a new word called malinformation to censor people like me. There was no misinformation on my Instagram account. Everything I put on that account was cited and sourced to peer-reviewed publications or government databases. Nobody has ever pointed to a single piece of misinformation that I published. I was removed for something they called malinformation. Malinformation is information that is true, but is inconvenient to the government, that they don't want people to hear. And that's antithetical to the values of our country. After I announced my presidency, it became more difficult for people to censor me outright. So now I'm subject to this new form of censorship, which is called targeted propaganda, where people apply pejoratives like anti-vax. I've never been anti-vaccine, but everybody in this room probably believes that I have been, because that's the prevailing narrative. Anti-Semitism, racism, these are the most appalling, disgusting pejoratives, and they're applied to me to silence me, because people don't want me to have that conversation about the war, about groceries, about inflation, about the war on the middle class in this country that we need to be having. And by the way, I want to say this while I'm on the record, that in my entire life, and why I'm under oath, in my entire life, I have never uttered a phrase that was either racist or anti-Semitic. I have spent my life fighting my professional career, fighting for Israel, for the protection of Israel. I have a better record on Israel than anybody in this chamber today. I'm the only person who has publicly objected to the $2 billion payout that the Biden administration is now making to Iran, which is a genocidal program. I'm the only one who's objected to that. I fought more ferociously for Israel than anybody. But I am being censored here through this target, through smears, through misinterpretations of what I've said, through lies, through association, which is a tactic that we all thought we had been discredited and dispensed with after the Army McCarthy hearings in the 1950s. But those same weapons are now being deployed against me to silence me. I know many of the people who wrote this letter. I don't believe there's a single person who signed this letter who believes I'm anti-Semitic. I do not believe that. There is no evidence of that. Now, I want to say something I think that's more important, and it goes directly to what you talked about, ranking member, which is the need, this toxic polarization that is destroying our country today. And how do we deal with that? This kind of division is more dangerous for our country than any time since the American Civil War. And how do we deal with that? How are we every Democrat on this committee believes that we need to end that polarization. Do you think you can do that by censoring people? I'm telling you, you cannot. That only aggravates and amplifies the problem. We need to start being kind to each other. We need to start being respectful to each other. We need to start restoring the comedy to this chamber and to the rest of America, but it has to start here. My uncle, Edward Kennedy, has more legislation with his name on it than any senator in United States history. Why is that? Because he was able to reach across the aisle, because he didn't deal in insults, because he didn't try to censor people. He brought home people who were antithetical to what he believed in. He came home almost every weekend with people like Orrin Hatch to our house at the compound in Hyannisport. At that time, Orrin Hatch to me was like Darth Vader, because I was an environmentalist. And I was saying, why is Teddy bringing this guy home? But he knew that he was effective because he understood that comedy and respect and kindness and compassion and empathy for other people is the way that the only way to restore the function in this chamber. But more importantly, today we need to give an example in the leadership of our country of being respectful to each other. If you think I said something that's anti-Semitic, let's talk about the details. I'm telling you all the things that I'm accused of right now by you. And in this letter are distortions, there are misrepresentations. I didn't say those things. There's fragments that I said, but I denounce anybody who uses the words that I have said to imply something that is negative about people who are Jewish. I never said those things. And I want to point out also that the chairman pointed to Dennis Kucinich, who's fighting behind me. There is no two people in the country who feel more differently about American politics than these two people. And yet they were friends. Dennis attended his children's basketball games, attended his daughter's wedding. This is what we need, how we need to start treating each other in this country. We have to stop trying to destroy each other, to marginalize, to vilify, to gaslight each other. We have to find that place inside of ourselves of light, of empathy, of compassion, and above all, we need to elevate the Constitution of the United States, which was written for hard times, and that has to be the premier compass for all of our activities. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to raise a point of order.
Gentlelady can state her point of order.
Point of order pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, which Mr. Kennedy is violative of. I move that we move into executive session because Mr. Kennedy has repeatedly made despicable anti-Semitic and anti-Asian comments as recently as last week. Rule 11, Clause 2 says, whenever it is asserted by a member of the committee that the evidence or testimony at a hearing may tend to defame, degrade, or incriminate any person, or it is asserted by a witness that the evidence or testimony that the witness would give at a hearing may tend to defame, degrade, or incriminate the witness, and it goes on. Mr. Kennedy, among many other things, has said, I know a lot now about bioweapons. We put out hundreds of millions of dollars into ethnically targeted microbes. The Chinese have done the same thing. In fact, COVID-19, there is an argument that it is ethnically targeted. COVID-19 attacks certain races disproportionately. The races that are most immune to COVID-19 are...
Gentlelady making a motion or a speech?
I've made a motion to move into executive session because Mr. Kennedy's testimony...
Mr. Chairman, I
and
move
his
to table the
previous
motion.
statements-
The gentleman from Kentucky has moved to table. Question is on
Mr.
the-
Chairman, I ask
question
for
is-
a roll call vote on the motion to table.
Well, let me ask the question. The question is on the motion to table. The gentlelady has asked for a roll call vote. The clerk will have to step back for a second. The clerk will have to come in. We'll call the roll on the motion to table, and then we can get back to testimony.
I think the witnesses can sit in the chairs sitting behind.
I'll leave that up to the clerks. If the clerks are comfortable with that, yeah, why don't we do that? Maybe we can go right down here.
Mr. Chairman, point of order.
Gentleman from Louisiana.
Is it the custom of this committee to censor viewpoints that we disagree with from witnesses?
Mr. Chairman, I have
That's not a point of
I have
order.
a motion on the table
There's a motion and the vote's
to
been
move into
called.
executive
House
session
rules.
We're waiting
because
for- we're
Mr.
waiting for
Kennedy
the clerks.
is violative of
Waiting
Rule
for the
11, Clause
clerks.
2.
Waiting for the clerks. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Jordan.
Yes.
Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Issa. Mr. Massey.
Yes, to not censor.
Mr. Massey votes yes. Mr. Stewart.
Yes.
Mr. Stewart votes yes. Ms. Stefanik.
Yes.
Ms. Stefanik votes yes. Mr. Gates. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana.
Yes.
Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes yes. Mr. Armstrong.
Yes.
Mr. Armstrong votes yes. Mr. Stube. Mr. Bishop. Yes. Mr. Bishop votes yes. Ms. Kamak.
Yes.
Ms. Kamak votes yes. Ms. Hageman. Yes. Ms. Hageman votes yes. Ms. Pasquette.
No, I want to follow the rules that the Republicans made at the beginning of this conference with these House rules, so no.
Ms. Pasquette votes no. Mr. Lynch. No. Mr. Lynch votes no. Ms. Sanchez.
No, because it's violative of the rules.
Ms. Sanchez votes no. Ms. Wasserman Schultz.
No to allowing a witness to degrade and
This is not
defame
speech
others
time.
and violate the rules and not have his testimony and degradation and amplified
Mr. Chair.
rather than given in executive session.
Ms. Wasserman Schultz votes no. Mr. Connolly.
No to the Soviet Politburo.
Mr. Connolly votes no. Mr. Garamendi.
No.
Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Allred. Ms. Garcia.
No.
Ms. Garcia votes no. Mr. Goldman.
No to hate speech.
Mr. Goldman votes no.
Jeez.
Mr. Gates. Yes.
Mr. Gates. Aye. Mr. Gates votes aye.
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 10 ayes and 8 noes.
The motion to table is agreed to. We will now move to our second witness. Ms. Morris, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me. My name is Emma Jo Morris, politics editor at Breitbart. I'm here today because I published a series of news stories 3 years ago in October of 2020 about Hunter Biden's now infamous laptop, also known as the laptop from hell, which is seen as some of the most scandalous reporting of the last decade. What was more scandalous than the reporting itself, though, was the fact that it exposed the unholy alliance between the intelligence community, social media platforms, and legacy media outlets. At the time, I was deputy politics editor at the New York Post, and my reporting showed that despite then-candidates Joe Biden's repeated and furious denials, he was apparently involved in the foreign business deals of his family. Over several days, just weeks before Americans would vote for their next president, I revealed verified, authentic emails from the Biden Scion's hard drive showing Ukrainian business partners receiving leaks from the Obama White House. I documented an off-the-books meeting between then Vice President Biden and a Ukrainian energy executive and introduced the world to the big guy who got action on a deal with CEFC, China Energy Company. The Post published exactly how the material for the reporting was obtained, even identifying our sources, as well as a federal subpoena showing the FBI was in possession of the material the story was based on and had been since December of 2019. But when the stories appeared on social media that morning, the venue where millions of Americans go to find their news and editors to get their angles, within hours, the reporting was censored on all major platforms on the basis of being called hacked or Russian disinformation. Twitter refused to allow users to share the link to the stories, banned the links from being shared in private messages, a policy, by the way, that's used to clamp down on child porn, and locked the Post out of its verified account. Facebook said it would curb distribution and reach of the links on its platform. However, the stories were not based on hacked materials, nor were they Russian disinformation, and despite those claims appearing to come out of thin air at the time, we would eventually learn that they actually didn't come out of thin air at all. On October 19th, 5 days after the Post began publishing, Politico ran a story headlined, "Hunter Biden's story is Russian disinfo, dozens of former intel officials say." God, I can't even say that with a straight face, you know? Politico printed a letter completely uncritically from veteran members of the US intelligence community, falsely claiming that the Post expose has, quote, all the classic earmarks of a Russian information operation. My God. Most notable among the signatories of that letter were Jim Clapper from former DNI, Michael Hayden, former CIA, John Brennan, former CIA, despite having such damaged credibility following their participation in the Russia collusion conspiracy theory. A few days later, on October 22nd, when Biden appeared in the second presidential debate and was confronted with the facts of the Post reporting, he said to Trump, quote, 50 former national intelligence professionals said this, what he's accusing me of is a Russian plot. But it was not, and he knew that. Now, fast forward to this year, 3 years later. Just last spring, House investigators revealed it was a call by now Secretary of State Antony Blinken to former acting CIA Director Michael Morell that prompted the spy letter published by Politico, which bypassed agency approval processes that would have been normally applied. It is also now known that ahead of my reporting, federal agencies were priming social media companies to execute an operation to discredit it. According to internal documents released by Elon Musk upon his acquisition of Twitter, the FBI and other intelligence community members essentially directed the platform's censorship operation, in part externally by working with top management, and in part internally by social media companies hiring eye-popping numbers of agency alumni. Journalist Michael Schallenberger reported, based on documents he obtained from Musk, that during all of 2020, the FBI and other law enforcement agencies repeatedly primed Twitter executives to dismiss reports of Hunter Biden's laptop as a Russian hack and leak operation. Feds arranged for top secret security clearances to be granted to Twitter management and even had encrypted messaging networks set up, which they dubbed a virtual war room. To this day, hundreds of people from the intelligence community work at social media companies. Over the last few years, my reporting has been confirmed by virtually every mainstream news outlet, from the Washington Post to the New York Times to Politico, when the stakes were nothing, by the way, 2 years later. No one denies that the laptop is real, that the origin story is exactly what I told you it was in the first place. This elaborate censorship conspiracy wasn't because the information being reported on was false. It was because it was true, and it was a threat to the power centers in this country. What this relationship between the US government officials and American corporations represent is an unprecedented push to undermine the First Amendment, the right to think, write, read, say whatever we want. And how we respond will determine whether we see a free press as inalienable or as optional. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Morris. Mr. Sauer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. On July 4th, 2023, Independence Day, Judge Terry A. Doty of the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Louisiana entered a historic injunction against the White House and other federal officials. This injunction prevents them from, quote, urging, encouraging, pressuring, or inducing in any manner the removal, deletion, suppression, or reduction of content containing protected free speech posted on social media platforms. Judge Doty's opinion contains 82 pages of detailed factual findings, supported by 577 citations of the evidence, which is drawn from roughly 20,000 pages of the federal government's own emails and communications with social media platforms and 6 full-length depositions. In its recently filed stay motions, the government has hardly bothered to dispute any of these factual findings. The Court of Appeals has entered a, quote, temporary administrative stay of this injunction and granted expedited briefing and argument on August 10th. Contrary to some recent suggestions, a temporary administrative stay is, quote, routine practice in the Fifth Circuit. That's a direct quote from the recent decision in N. Ray Abbott. And it does not reflect any judgment of the merits. Today, I want to offer 7 observations drawn from the Louisiana opinion. First, the Louisiana court found, based on overwhelming evidence, that federal officials are the cause of the censorship of the viewpoints they disfavor. The government likes to claim that social media platforms acting on their own would apply their policies and censor all this content anyway. This is demonstrably incorrect. Again and again, the Louisiana court found that the platforms would not have suppressed this speech, but for the fact that the federal officials were pushing for it. The deplatforming of Alex Berenson, the throttling of Tucker Carlson's content, the silencing of the so-called disinformation dozen, which includes Mr. Kennedy, the suppression of much of the so-called borderline, which is, quote, often true content on Facebook's platforms, the censorship of the Hunter Biden laptop story, and much more. All these were suppressed because of the efforts of federal officials. Second, the scope and reach of federal censorship is staggering. As the Louisiana court repeatedly found, it affects, quotes, millions of social media posts and speakers all across America. It affects virtually every American who reads, listens, engages, or posts on social media about great disputed political and social questions that federal censors have stuck their fingers into. Third, federal censorship is ongoing and it shows no signs of relenting. Federal officials' censorship efforts are in full swing, and they're expanding to new frontiers. Left unchecked, federal censorship will reach virtually any disputed social and political question over which federal officials want to impose their power. Fourth, The Louisiana opinion shows that federal officials are most eager, most focused on silencing truthful speech and to muzzle the most influential critics of the administration and its policies. Tucker Carlson, Alex Berenson, and many others were targeted not because what they were saying was necessarily false, but because it was the most effective criticism of the narrative line that the administration was pushing at the time. Censorship is not about truth. It is about power, preserving and expanding the power of the censors and the political narratives they prefer. Fifth, federal officials are deeply intertwined with what other witnesses have called the censorship industrial complex. The Louisiana court made very detailed findings about the close connections between many federal officials and that mass surveillance and mass censorship enterprise that calls itself the Election Integrity Partnership and the Virality Project. Not just CISA officials, but White House, State Department, and Surgeon General officials have deep ties to that enterprise. As the Louisiana court found, CISA and the EIP were completely intertwined. Sixth, federal officials don't just dictate the outcomes of specific content moderation decisions. They also directly induce changes to the content moderation policies of major social media platforms to ban disfavored viewpoints in advance. And seventh, the federal censorship enterprise has succeeded in transforming online discourse by rendering entire viewpoints virtually unspeakable on social media, which is the modern public square. This ongoing distortion of the most fundamental American freedom, the right to free speech, is intolerable under the First Amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sauer. Ms. Wiley, you're recognized.
Microphone.
I'm usually quite loud, but thank you for pointing that out. Chair Jordan, Ranking Member Plaskett, members of the subcommittee, I want to thank you for having me here today. I have introduced written testimony, and I did have a summary of my oral testimony, and I am going to depart from it after listening to the openings and these proceedings. This week began the sentencing of Robert Bowers, who murdered 11 people, wounded 6 others, because their faith was Judaism and because they were in a synagogue to worship. Robert Bowers expressed on social media for a very long time deeply anti-Semitic, hateful statements. He did it and used Gab, which is a platform that was deplatformed by Twitter because of its constant space it provided to hate that has actually become embodied in the most violent anti-Semitic act we know to have happened on our shores in the history of this country. And I will tell you, as a Black woman who lived through COVID in New York City, where we watched too many images of refrigerated trucks with the bodies of loved ones because there were too many deaths to accommodate in morgues that surpassed the deaths during the Spanish flu, and where in this country we have lost over 1 million of our loved ones. And for the Black community, for the Native American community, for so many communities of color in particular, where our rates of death were 3 to 4 times those of some other groups. 3 to 4 times. I want to agree with Mr. Kennedy. I want to agree that it's incredibly important for us to be kind and respectful to one another. It is incredibly important for us to be able to understand our experiences across our differences and to have a platform for those communications. And it is deeply vital that they be based in fact, not fiction. and without regard to the intent or what is in the mind of anyone, which I cannot say, including what is in the mind of any of those who are testifying here today. But what I can say is when you make a statement that suggests that based on race, based on religion, based on anything other than facts, that you may have somehow not been targeted, but other racial groups have, that by definition feeds into something very dangerous in this country that is actually impacting lives, and in some instances taking them. And what I will say about the opinion in this case, and I am here to talk about Missouri versus Biden, is that in this case, we can talk all day about the very specific facts, and there is factual inaccuracy in some of the fact statements in Judge Dougherty's opinion. But the most important one is the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, widely believed by all, for very good reason, to not be out of step with conservative ideology, vacated that preliminary injunction. And I want to point to something else, because one of the things that that injunction said was that our government, responsible for public health, responsible for national security, which, by the way, even under the Trump administration, the Department of Homeland Security said it is domestic terrorism that is our greatest national threat. That even that, it had in the injunction a statement that the federal government could not collaborate or partner or jointly work with institutes, researchers, including the Stanford Internet Observatory, could not, in terms of identifying, understanding, or even talking about the deletion or removal of anything, even if that research actually demonstrated that those social media companies were violating their own policy in a way that was dangerous for people and for our democracy. So yes, let's be kind, let's be respectful, and let's descend into a real discussion of facts where we can disagree about their meaning, but not about their existence. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. We will now turn to 5-minute question. The chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop, for 5 minutes. And we will go a couple rounds here, I think, and then they have called votes, so we'll get to votes pretty quick. But the gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to focus on the testimony the chairman made reference to, and that the ranking member was so concerned with damage control that she opened her comments about it. And I'd ask staff to put the blow-ups on the screen as we proceed. And Ms. Morris, you can begin with number one while I'm getting my first question out. Ms. Morris, in your statement, you had an interesting turn of phrase. You said that no one denies that the laptop is real. What an interesting turn of phrase, because that's exactly what Twitter was asking about the day your story appeared, and it was interacting still further with Twitter and with Facebook. Ms. Dimlow testified, here it is on the screen for those who are visual learners like me. Are you familiar with the October 2020 New York Post story on Hunter Biden's laptop? I am. This is Ms. Dimlow under oath. Do you recall whether any of these social media companies you were meeting with asked you any questions about it? I do. Please proceed to the next slide. And here's how, in the same page, but it was relayed to me later that somebody from Twitter, I don't recall who, I'm not sure who, somebody from Twitter essentially asked whether the laptop was real. And one of the FBI folks who was on the call did confirm that, yes, it was, before another participant jumped in and said no further comment. Proceed to the next slide. So you said he was one example. Do you recall other social media companies? Proceed to the next slide. Ms. Dimlow says, I believe Facebook. We met with Facebook soon thereafter. Can't remember if it was the same day or within a couple of days. And they also asked. And I said, no comment. That was the decision we made in those post-meeting deliberations, which is pretty typical. It was an ongoing investigation, and we don't generally comment on ongoing investigative matters when asked. So, Ms. Morris, to your point, I think this shows one thing for sure. You credited Michael Schellenberger and some of his reporting. One of the things that he asked in one of his Twitter Files stories was whether the Foreign Influence Task Force people, the FBI folks who were interfacing with the social media companies, whether they knew about the Hunter Biden laptop contents that the FBI had since December 2019. So now we know, right? The Foreign Influence Task Force knew it was real. And it wasn't just a few people, it was common knowledge. An analyst on that telephone call before they got their act together admitted that it was real. And then we also know that the social media companies wanted to know if it was real. Of course they did, because the FBI had been telling them for months to be prepared for a hack and leak operation and also to be prepared for something involving Hunter Biden. Of course they wanted to know. So what do you think about the fact that the FBI, in response to Twitter, told them it was real, then they covered that up or stopped, no further comment, and to Facebook, with its billions of users, said, no comment, we're not going to tell you?
Yeah, we know that the FBI knew that it was real. They knew it was real since not just December 2019, which is when the subpoena that I published is from, which was in the original story, the thanks for the meeting with your father from Ukraine story. We published the subpoena. And they had already confirmed, though, which we would learn later, they had already confirmed that the laptop was real and the quote, not manipulated in any way, quote, in November of 2019, a month before they actually obtained the laptop to keep, which is when they gave that subpoena to John Paul Mac Isaac, the owner of the Mac store where Hunter Biden forgot the laptop. And I think that's something that gets glazed over in this reporting. I'm so familiar with it, it's nauseating, which is that Jim Baker was the deputy counsel at Twitter. And if that name doesn't sound familiar, I'll remind you all who that is. He's the former deputy counsel of the FBI. Like, are we supposed to all sit here and pretend that he didn't know what that subpoena was when he saw it in the New York Post? I mean, let's not insult our intelligence here and the intelligence of the American people. Obviously, he knew what it was.
Point well taken, Ms. Morris, and my time's expired, but what we have always understood in all likelihood was true, we now have yet one more piece of evidence from the folks at the FBI that they interfered. Comey interfered in 2016. Was it Director Wray himself who interfered in 2020? We still need to know.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes. And I think we'll do ranking member and one more, and then we'll have to take a break.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know that we talked earlier about a post that Mr. Kennedy had at the beginning of the Biden administration. I just want the record to reflect that that post has not been taken down. So I'm wondering about the extent of censorship when the post is still there. But more importantly, again, I go back to just the fact that we are creating a platform for this kind of discussion, not about the censorship, not about free speech, but the content of some of that speech that we are amplifying in this room. I'm appalled and just so troubled by colleagues that I have to work with, that these are individuals who would bring a witness who's promoted a video that compared the COVID vaccine to the Tuskegee trials. The Tuskegee trials were a very difficult time in Black America, where individuals who were already sick with a disease were then reviewed, experimented on, who already had a disease
to see how far that disease went. And making the comparison that manipulates and preys on Black people's feelings about the atrocities of the past in order to prevent them from seeking life-saving vaccines in the present. And knowing that this is dangerous, I cannot also be unaware that this comes from an individual who, by Mr. Roy's introduction, is very smart and understands the implications of this. You know, Mr. Kennedy's own family decries his stance on vaccines, and families disagree on a lot of things. I got family members that, you know, we all disagree, so that doesn't mean anything. But the fact that he has famously sent a request to a party guest that they had to be vaccinated to come to his party. And I'd like to introduce into the record a letter from Louis Silkin, a law firm representing Mr. Kennedy, which states, as he has stated repeatedly, he vaccinated all his children, and I'd like that to be introduced into the record, but tells the Black community and myself, a mother of 5 Black children, that I should really be careful and not necessarily have the same safeguards to protect my family, my children, from a virus that has killed millions of people because I'm Black. There's no secret that this is an amplification of his own platform. You know, I'm not going to talk about the money that's received from the Children's Health Defense, from his anti-vaccine organization that's responsible for a majority of the false information out there about COVID, and the notoriety that's gained from it by manipulating Black and other vulnerable communities to propagate these pseudosciences. Ms. Wiley, are you aware of the phrase superhuman yet subhumanization?
I can't say I'm aware of the phrase. I am aware of the viewpoint.
And can you share what you believe that to mean when it comes to Black people?
Well, sadly and unfortunately, we have a history in this country where Black people were both by law and by social view viewed as inferior and subhuman, and that there were stereotypes attached to that that includes all kinds of myth about the ability to disregard both the health needs, health conditions, and disparities that exist for Black people and in Black communities, to the detriment not only of the health of people who are Black, but also to public health by not taking good, sound
Yes, that, you know,
positions.
in chattel slavery, you don't have to feed them the same way because they can take it. They can handle that. They don't need as much. Or now with COVID, they've got superhuman genes that they don't need to get the same vaccines in, and they may be more susceptible if you get vaccines. Ms. Wiley, why do you think someone might choose to target the Black community for false health information about vaccines?
Well, I can't say that I can sit in a position to explain why anyone would do that. I can only say that for those who wished to prevent people from getting a vaccine, it was very clear that one of the ways in which you could convince people not to is to play on fears that have basis in historic experience. Sadly, and frankly, and I can say this personally speaking from having conversations with friends, with people I worked with
family members.
who were terrified of whether or not there might be some adverse consequences for them because of the Tuskegee experiments, explicitly referring to times in which Black people had been tested on without their permission or denied access to medical intervention despite awareness that it would be detrimental to their health. That distrust has historical fact. And we have come to a point where, in terms of the COVID vaccine and what we were being told by scientists, including the ways in which both the CDC, the World Health Organization, and others we're examining, we're actually putting out factual information both about the degree to which testing and trials before approval had included people who are black, people who are Asian, and therefore had more basis in fact to be able to state scientifically.
Time of the
that that
gentlelady.
was safe.
Time of the gentlelady is expired. Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from North Dakota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to yield my time to Representative Massey.
I thank the gentleman from North Dakota. Wow, the irony and cognitive dissonance from the other side of the aisle. It's deafening. You could cut it with a knife. They are at the same time denying that censorship is occurring, but suggesting that there's more material that needs to be censored. This is a hearing on censorship that began with an effort, with a formal motion from the other side of the aisle to censor Mr. Kennedy. They do not want him to speak, yet that is the topic of this hearing. They have kept him from speaking. A collusion between the government and private organizations. Mr. Kennedy, in your opening statement, you introduced us to this word malinformation. Can you tell us more about this made-up word, what it means, and some of the things that you've said or tried to say that you've been censored for that's been characterized as malinformation?
Yes, Congressman Massey, and if by your leave, I'd like to just respond very briefly to some of the, what I would call defamations that have been just applied to me by the ranking member. I'm happy to talk to you about my opinions on these issues, what you have stated and tried to associate me with through guilt by association is simply inaccurate. Virtually everything, every statement that you just made about me is inaccurate. I have never advised Black Americans not to receive vaccines. At one point you say I'm anti-vax, and that's a bad thing. The other moment you point out that all my children are vaxxed. I'm fully compliant with the vaccine schedule myself, except for COVID. I took flu vaccines for 20 years straight. I have never been anti-vax. I have never told the public avoid vaccination. The only thing I've asked for, and my views are constantly misrepresented, so that the truth of what I believe is not, we're not allowed to have a conversation about that with the American people, which I believe vaccines should be tested with the same rigor as other medicines and medications. You tried to associate me a moment ago with the replacement theory, which is racist.
No, I did not say you
Time
had the
belongs to the
replacement
gentleman
theory.
from
I said my colleagues.
The time belongs to the gentleman from
I
Kentucky.
denounce that theory. It is racist, and I have never endorsed it or had any association with it. Our film on a medical, by the way,
medical apartheid?
Bill Buxton, who is the Black CDC official who ultimately exposed the Tuskegee experiment, tried for years and years to appeal to CDC to stop it for 40 years. Finally, he got relief by walking into my uncle's office in the building next door. Teddy held hearings and ended the experiment. I remember that very well. And to say that I created a film that encourages blacks not to get adequate medical care is just completely abhorrent.
Don't misuse my words.
It's the witness's time. Do not censor the witness.
I'm not censoring the witness. I'm not censoring the witness. He's still talking.
It's my time, and I've given it to the witness. Do not censor him.
I'm not censoring him.
If the views that you and others have applied to me, have attributed to me, if they were actually true, I can see why I shouldn't be able to testify here today. Those are not true. These are defamations and malignancies that are used to censor me, to prevent people from listening to the actual things that I'm saying. And I think, Ranking Member, that we should have a real conversation rather than an exchange of ad hominem attacks. And answer very quickly to your question, the term malinformation was coined to describe information that Facebook and Twitter and the other social media sites understood was true, but that the White House and other federal agencies wanted censored anyway for political reasons. because it challenged official orthodoxies. I'll give you one example. I was included in a group called the Disinformation Dozen. And Facebook and others were asked to censor us, which they did. And by the way, my Hank Aaron post, it was taken down. My whole Instagram account with 900,000 people was taken down because of that. Oh, they knew, Facebook knew that the Disinformation Dozen claim, and what they said was the Disinformation Dozen came from this very shady group called the Center for Preventing Digital Hate in England that's funded by dark money that should be looked into. They claim that 65% of the vaccine misinformation on the internet was generated by those 12 people. Facebook itself said that is impossible. That is false information. We know that not to be true. And yet, when the White House asked them to censor this Disinformation Dozen, including me, they did it anyway when they knew it to be untrue.
My time has expired. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
Mr. Chairman, I have a unanimous consent motion before we head to
You see
votes.
from the gentleman from New York.
I would like to introduce page 2 of the transcript of Laura Demlow, where specifically she says, she's asked, if someone were to leave here today, were to leave at this interview and were to suggest or imply or state that when you said, quote, the laptop was real, unquote, that it meant that the FBI had affirmatively determined in October 2020 that the laptop belonged to Hunter Biden, that the contents belonged to Hunter Biden, that the contents had not been manipulated in some way, they would be misrepresenting what you said, correct? Answer, they would be misrepresenting what I said because I don't have much knowledge of that.
Without objection, I think that's already been introduced, but without objection, we'll do it again. We're
Sorry,
going to
it's
stand
page
in recess.
55.
We stand in recess for approximately 45 minutes, and we'll be back and right back at it. Thank you all, and you can head in the back room. Miss Wiley, Miss Morris. Miss Morris. Committee will come to order. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I have a point of order.
Point of order.
Mr. Roy.
Mr. Chairman, I have a point of order.
Gentleman, consider point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I just missed 2 votes on the House floor because we were not given we did not recess on time. I think many of my colleagues are
That's not
probably
not a properly stated point of order. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
What is the intent of the chair in the future recesses so that to avoid the censorship of the voice of my constituents because I was not able
Chair
to voice
recognizes-
their views on important items on the agenda?
Oh, that's right, that's right.
Question of, yeah.
Yeah, actually, the chair recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts for his 5 minutes. I apologize.
Mr.
Mr.
Chairman,
Chairman,
may
I
I
have
just introduce, ask unanimous consent to introduce an article from NPR, June 8, 2021, discussing the film Medical Racism, where viewers are warned that in Black communities, something is very sinister. And the same thing that happened in the 1930s during the eugenics movement is happening again.
Without objection, will be entered in the record. The chair
Thank
recognizes
you.
the gentleman from Massachusetts for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, one of the saddest parts of this fabricated circus of outrage is the drumbeat of attacks that I have seen against the men and women of the Department of Justice and the FBI, many of them armed service veterans who in their earlier careers actually put on the uniform of this country and served honorably, as well as attacks against Department of Homeland Security, CDC, and Health and Human Services. And as evidenced today's hearing, the Republicans are continuing to go to great lengths to invoke wild and seemingly race-based conspiracy theories, misinformation, and propaganda to allege that those same men and women who at one point served our country in uniform are now somehow targeting the American people. Meanwhile, this same subcommittee on weaponization has turned completely a blind eye to the actual and well-documented blatant and egregious weaponization of the federal government undertaken by the previous president. We are, in fact, still receiving reports of actual weaponization committed by President Trump. In fact, we now have a recent sworn declaration from former White House Chief of Staff John Kelly indicating that President Trump suggested utilizing the IRS and other federal agencies to investigate his perceived enemies, who at the time happened to be 2 FBI agents who are examining his conduct. I ask for unanimous consent for this record, this sworn statement to be entered into the record.
Without objection.
We also have another recent disclosure from Miles Taylor, former Chief of Staff at the Department of Homeland Security, reporting that President Trump sought to wiretap the phones of his own White House aides in order to detect any leaks. To the great detriment of the American people, however, we are not investigating the actual weaponization of the federal government. And worse yet, this committee has come to embody weaponization itself, misusing congressional oversight to protect Donald Trump and attempt to divert attention from the multiple federal and state criminal investigations surrounding President Trump's misconduct in office. In the midst of the ongoing state prosecution in New York of President Trump, Chairman Jordan has repeatedly sought to interfere and influence that case, threatening to subpoena Mr. Bragg, and even holding a field hearing on Mr. Bragg's prosecutorial record blocks from his lower Manhattan office, deliberately interfering in the rule of law being applied in that case. The Republican members of this committee have also followed the shameful example set by the former president in targeting the independent federal law enforcement personnel that have sought to hold Donald Trump accountable. These are the good and patriotic Americans trying to uphold the rule of law within the FBI and the Department of Justice. In the same vein as President Trump describing the Department of Justice and the FBI, my Republican colleagues have described these individuals as scoundrels, quote, vicious monsters. And the chairman of the other Republican members of this committee have continually described these agencies as, quote, corrupt, out of control, and rotten to the core. These are the men and women who are serving our country in the Department of Justice, trying to uphold the rule of law. Ms. Wiley, what is the underlying threat to American democracy and the rule of law to baselessly claim that the federal agency and the individual personnel at the Department of Justice and FBI are being weaponized to attack everyday Americans? What's the impact of that on our democracy? Your mic. Yeah.
Okay. Unfortunately, Congressman, there's more than one impact. One impact that's very clear and obvious, sadly, for far too many, is that foreign governments who have deep interest in sowing distrust in the American people against our own government and our own civil servants utilize that to generate and propagate mis and disinformation that then it puts out under disguise on social media platforms to help incite and spread the notion, seemingly in a way that suggests that it is not coming from a foreign government, so that it is sowing the seeds, not just of distrust, but fundamentally in any democratic country, it is critically important that we be able to have a relationship with our government and with law enforcement in order to make sure that people are coming forward to law enforcement, sharing information truthfully with law enforcement, and that law enforcement can engage in investigations into any version of potential crimes that have been committed in violation of our own laws without interference and without the refusal or inability to do so in a manner that also holds the privacy and protection of people's rights by also keeping that quiet, which is centrally important to criminal investigations.
Time of the gentleman from Massachusetts expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gates.
Yield to Mr. Roy.
Mr. Roy is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman from Florida. I thank the chairman. Mr. Kennedy, first of all, your father served as the Attorney General of the United States. I'm a former Assistant United States Attorney. Do you believe that it is a proper function and role for Congress and for all of us to question whoever happens to be in the seat at the office of the Attorney General or in the FBI or in upper levels of government generally to seek the truth, wherever it may lead?
Make sure your mic's on.
Your microphone.
That is exactly the function that the United States Constitution assigned to the people to the members of Congress. And I would say this: I don't want President Trump misusing the FBI, and I don't want President Biden. None of us should want anybody.
Amen. And I agree with that completely. Let me characterize my understanding of something and get your perspective on it. Following the 2016 election, Dr. Fauci, Dr. Collins, Peter Marks met with you, to the best of my understanding, regarding vaccine safety, in part as a result of your engagement with President Trump. And at that meeting, you requested evidence of a vaccine undergoing placebo-controlled trial safety tests prior to licensing. After making a show of looking for the document, Dr. Fauci informed you, to the best of my understanding, that the document was back in Bethesda and that he would eventually send the document to you. The document, to the best of my knowledge, was never sent, and that you sued HHS for documents showing and trying to figure out the truth of the matter, and that you found that not one study was done on pre-licensing safety testing for COVID vaccines. After a year, HHS finally sent you a letter stating, we don't have any. This means, to the best of my understanding, that nobody knows the risk profiles for these products or whether they avert more harm than they cause. And as a result, there's no real science behind these statements, but rather guesswork. Is that a fair characterization of what you've experienced.
That is a fair characterization. We had looked for many years to find a pre-licensing safety trial of any of the 72 vaccines doses that are now essentially mandated. They're recommended, but that's effectively mandated for American children, and we had not been able to find any. And every other medication requires, prior to licensing by FDA, that the company perform a safety trial that compares health outcomes in a placebo group and a similarly situated vaccine group. My assumption was that was done for vaccines. We found out that it hadn't been, that it was not, they were exempt. And I made that statement publicly. Dr. Fauci contradicted me, and when President Trump ordered him to meet with me, him and Francis Collins and a group of my colleagues, I said to them at that time, you've said publicly that I've been dishonest about that. Can you show us a single pre-licensing safety trial, placebo-controlled safety trial for any of the 72 vaccines required for American children? And he made that show of looking through a file, and he said, well, they're back in Bethesda. And I said, will you send them to me? And I never heard from him again, so we sued the HHS under the Freedom of Information Law. After a year of litigation, they sent us a letter which is posted on CHD's website that acknowledges that they are now not able to locate a single pre-licensing safety trial, placebo-controlled for any of the vaccines that are now mandated for children. These are zero liability vaccines.
And so if I might interject in just limited time, and I hope you can expand on that further. I know my friend from Kentucky, Mr. Massey, will probably expand on this later, but your uncle, Senator Ted Kennedy, was a pretty strong opponent of sweeping immunity from liability for manufacturers of vaccines. And did he not introduce an amendment to repeal the so-called PrEP Act, the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act, when he was a senator?
Yes, he did. And, the immunity which was passed in 1986, neither the Republicans or Democrats wanted it. Ronald Reagan at that time, who signed the bill, said, and Wyeth was the company that was pushing it, and they were saying that they were losing $20 in downstream liabilities for every dollar that they made in profits from vaccines. They were going to get out of the business if they were not granted immunity. Ronald Reagan said to them at that time, why don't you make the vaccines safe? And Wyatt said, because they're unavoidably unsafe, which is true of most medicines. I'm not anti-vaccine, but I think we need to be honest and we need to have good science. That's all I've ever argued.
And closing out my time here, I would just say this. My father had polio. I understand the ravages of that disease. I'm grateful that we have the opportunity to have the polio vaccine, but I also want the truth being sought. I want to know the health impacts of the polio vaccine going forward and every other vaccine that's being administered. And I'll just close by saying and asking, I know that this is informed by a great deal of conversations you've had with mothers and moms who came up to you, and if you could expand on that, I'll yield back.
Yeah, I was dragged kicking and screaming into this space because I was confronted by, when I was touring the country on suing companies about mercury and fish. And by the way, people, I spent 30 years trying to get mercury out of the fish in this country, and nobody ever called me anti-fish. At that time, we were trying to get mercury out of vaccines because mothers were coming and saying, my child was injured by the vaccine. These were many, many hundreds, literally, of mothers with intellectual disabilities. And they said, nobody's listening to us. The Democrats aren't listening to us. The Republicans aren't listening to us, and I felt like I should listen to them and actually read the science, and that is what got me down into the time. And by the way, it's the worst career decision I have ever made.
Time of the gentleman.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. You'll back.
Time of the gentleman expired. The gentlelady from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member Plaskett. During the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, anti-Asian hate and violence skyrocketed as some racists blamed a virus coming out of China on all Asian Americans. Since March of 2020, Stop AAPI Hate, a nonprofit organization aimed at tracking and addressing anti-Asian hate, reported more than 11,000 anti-Asian acts of hate and violence. This same report found that 49% of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have experienced some form of discrimination. These acts of hate include Asian Americans being beaten, spit on, screamed at, and even killed. And the increases in these types of attacks during COVID accompanied a slew of anti-Chinese sentiments related to the virus, like calling it the quote-unquote China virus and even disgustingly quote-unquote Kung flu. Many Asian Americans were harassed, physically accosted, and told that they quote-unquote created the virus. Yet one of our Republican witnesses encourages this appalling rhetoric and promotes anti-Asian hate with dangerous and unfounded claims. Just last week, Mr. Kennedy suggested COVID-19 was a bioweapon and said it was, quote, targeted to attack Caucasians and Black people, end quote, and that, quote, the people who are most immune are Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese, end quote, suggesting that the Chinese people didn't suffer like others during the pandemic. Despite asserting that he should become their president, Mr. Kennedy seems to disregard the correlation between anti-Asian rhetoric and violence. Ms. Wiley, do you frequently work with minority communities, including Chinese American or other Asian American communities?
I do.
And do you think Mr. Kennedy's theory is racist?
I think that Mr. Kennedy's statements fuels the theories that suggest that there's a biology to race and that therefore we can actually identify people and communities as possibly either being benefited by or being people who are not sharing the same interests and needs as the rest of us. And yes, that has served to drive hate and bias, and sadly, including violent incidents.
Now, it was said earlier in this hearing that Mr. Kennedy is a smart man. Now, so far as I know, he does not have any specific education or training in medicine. He is not an epidemiologist, one who studies infectious diseases. He has never conducted clinical trials in a professional setting. He has never done scientific research in a professional laboratory and published scientific findings in a peer-reviewed publication. Ms. Wiley, what kind of harm does someone with absolutely no medical training or knowledge do when they espouse unfounded anti-Asian vaccine theories during a fraught time like COVID?
One of the things that happened in this historic pandemic was that there was certainly a need to get on top of very quickly what the science said. I am not a scientist either. And so what social media platforms did was go and speak to government agencies because their own policies, their own user agreements required them to look at and figure out what the facts were so that they could assess what was responsible and what was not responsible to post. I say that because it was incredibly important to ensure that people were getting real-time information as possible, but also ones that really demonstrated what all of us need, rather than where and how we should ascribe blame or where and how we should consider who benefits and who doesn't, because we were all harmed. But I say this in part because it was the social media platforms themselves that reached out to government agencies, including Health and Human Services and CDC, to get that information. And under the vacated opinion, it's really important to understand, it has been vacated by the Fifth Circuit, this preliminary injunction on all these incidents that we're talking about, because one of the things it would do, in my view, just as in my legal view, is that it was actually saying that the government could not respond to such requests under this injunction, which is incredibly overbroad, dangerous, and doesn't allow government agencies to do what they are chartered to do.
Now, I'm an attorney by training, and one of the things I learned very early on in constitutional law is that no right given to the people of the United States is absolute, and that includes the right to free speech, because you do not have the right to shout fire in a crowded theater because it could produce harm and death of people by being false. These social media platforms have user policies to try to prevent that kind of harm. Is that not correct, Ms. Wiley?
That is correct.
And so we are not trying to censor speech. We are simply trying to create factually correct information to prevent harm to people, including death. And that's what they were trying to do during COVID. Is that not correct?
Legally speaking, absolutely. And I say that as a matter of law, which is that court cases say that the government has in fact, it's its role to ask for compliance with policies. The policies on the books of social media platforms
Time of the-
were violated.
Time of
And
the-
they
Excuse
said
me,
those-
Mr. Chairman, but the last questioner got an additional extra minute. I'm at 35 seconds over. I would just
Point of order,
ask that
Mr.
she
Chairman.
be
The
able to
Democrat
finish-
beforehand got an extra
finish
minute.
her sentence.
Trying to be generous.
Finish her
I'm trying to be
sentence.
generous, even when the response is that the government determines the truth. I'm
I
trying
would
to be
like for
generous.
her to be able to finish her sentence, Mr. Chairman, then I will yield back.
Okay, Ms. Wiley, you can finish your sentence.
Thank you.
I'm not sure I remember the sentence, but
Okay.
thank you.
Okay.
I just think the
I
point
do.
was, it was.
I do. You were saying
there's
the
a
government
record-
should be the arbiter
Can
of
you
what's
please
truth.
not put
That's
words into
actually-
the mouth of the witness and let her respond?
The chair
It's
now
her
recognizes the
answer.
gentlelady from New York, the gentlelady from California.
I love how you follow the rules, Mr. Chairman. It's really indicative of what a kangaroo court this is and what a
It's
circus it
censorship
is.
by the chair. It's censorship by the chair.
Oh, Lord.
Thank you,
Gentlelady from
Mr.
New York is
Chairman. Thank you,
recognized.
Mr. Chairman. Ms. Morris, isn't it true that your October 2020 Hunter Biden laptop from hell story has proven to be 100% factually accurate?
I was 27 when I published that story. It better have been.
Isn't it true that the FBI obtained Hunter Biden's laptop a full 10 months before your story broke?
That's correct, according to the subpoena that I published.
Isn't it also true that we now know that the FBI's Foreign Influence Task Force coerced social media companies into an alleged forthcoming Russian, quote, hack and leak operation, and as a result, illegally censored the Hunter Biden laptop story? Isn't that true?
Yes.
And this forced censorship by government agencies like the FBI was paid for by the taxpayer, since the taxpayers fund the FBI. Isn't that true?
Yes.
And Hunter Biden's laptop from hell, it has everything. It's a hellhole and cesspool of corruption and criminal conduct. It has hard drugs, prostitution, pornography, money laundering. It has Biden family shell companies, communist Chinese, corrupt foreign government deals for tens of millions of dollars in exchange for access to the Biden family. The Hunter Biden laptop from hell has all of this, correct?
Yeah.
And the American people are smart. They know that this was not a hack and dump. This was illegal government censorship to protect and prop up Joe Biden on the eve of the 2020 election. And according to polling, of people who were now made aware of the Hunter Biden laptop story, 53% would have changed their vote, including 61% of Democrats. So do you agree that the censorship of the Hunter Biden laptop story was determinative in the 2020 election, Ms. Morris?
Yeah, there are various polls that say that that there would have been a change in the outcome of the election, and obviously it's immediately relevant to a decision on who to vote for, so obviously.
And do you believe that this government censorship was election interference?
Yes, any censorship of speech prevents your ability to think clearly. Yes, of course, yes.
And Mr. Kennedy, I want to turn to you. You've heard me lay out this example of egregious and illegal government censorship. You have been censored yourself. Do you believe that government censorship is a form of election interference?
Yeah, I think democracy is dependent on the free flow of information. And if that information is distorted, if the public is lied to, then it interferes with election. And by the way, it interferes with public health. And the Wall Street Journal did an article a couple of weeks ago suggesting that the censorship of important health information cost American lives.
And Mr. Kennedy, I want to ask you specifically about the Hunter Biden laptop story. The total blackout on all social media outlets as well as telecom. You couldn't text the link to the Hunter Biden laptop story. This specifically was a form of election interference by the U.S. government in the 2020 election.
I don't know enough about it. I know that there was censorship on that story and other stories that, presumably could have changed people's minds about the election.
And we know the polling demonstrates that now. People have said they would have changed their vote had they been made aware of the Hunter Biden laptop story. Isn't that correct?
I'm not aware of that, but I'm not surprised.
Mr. Sauer, I want to turn to you. I want your reflection on this form of government censorship, specifically in the 2020 election, as a form of election interference, and what I believe is some of the, most egregious political scandals that, I will live through in my lifetime. Mr. Sauer, what are your reflections?
I strongly agree with your characterization of that form of censorship as election interference. The evidence in our case strongly supports that. It strongly supports, and actually we have judicial findings now, that the suppression of the Hunter Biden laptop story was done at the instigation of federal officials in the FBI at a very high level of that organization. It was an orchestrated campaign of deception that was anticipatory, it was planned in advance, and it was, I think, consummated with the testimony that I hadn't seen before that's been put up today from Ms. Demlow, characterizing how, at the very end, the FBI then clammed up at the last minute after spending months of seeding the record in these endless, ceaseless meetings with social media platforms about there's a hack and dump coming, it's going to involve Hunter Biden. Then when it actually came, they said, well, no comment. Our judge focused on that particular issue as kind of the coup de grace in this form of election interference.
Thank you. My time's expired.
Mr. Chairman, a point of order.
I have a unanimous consent request.
The gentlelady from California is recognized for unanimous consent.
My majority counterparts have repeatedly cited a district court opinion from Louisiana, and I would like to introduce for the record the Fifth Circuit order staying that opinion almost as soon as it was issued.
Objection. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from...
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
The distinguished gentlelady from New York mentioned a poll. I would just ask that she identify what poll that is, and if we could enter it into the record.
I'm sure she'll be happy
We
to
will
do
submit
that.
it for the record.
Can you identify what it is?
Sure, I will submit it for the record, and you'll be able to review it.
We'll get it. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Wasserman-Schultz. Good job.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, we respectfully requested that you rescind Mr. Kennedy's invitation to appear here due to his repeated and very recent statements that spread dangerous anti-Semitic and anti-Asian conspiracy theories and attempted to move into executive session because House rules prohibit public testimony that degrades or defames people. His reckless rhetoric helped fuel anti-Semitic incidents, which for the record are at the highest level in the United States since 1970. They have nearly tripled in the last 6 years. Since you gave Mr. Kennedy a megaphone today, I want to give him a chance to correct his statements and prepare some of the harm that he's helped cause. Mr. Kennedy, you're well educated, so yes or no, please. Are you aware that for centuries Jews have been scapegoated and blamed for causing illnesses like Black Plague and more recently COVID?
I am. Those are known as blood libel, and they are one of the worst and most disturbing parts of human history.
Good. I'm glad to know that, of course, that you acknowledge that. Of course, it's true and well documented that this pernicious form of anti-Semitism led to centuries of discrimination, even horrific pogroms and massacres, and it still fuels deadly violence today. Yet last week, you floated a baseless conspiracy theory that the coronavirus was bioengineered to target Caucasians and Black people, but to spare Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese people. Mr. Kennedy, your bizarre, unproven claim echoes that same historic slander of labeling Jews and Chinese people as a race, and that Jews, and in this case Chinese people, somehow managed to avoid a deadly illness that targets other groups for death. You do see that, yes or no?
You're misstating.
No. I quoted what you said earlier, and it is directly what you said. So just ask me yes or no.
I was describing an NIH-funded study.
No, you didn't cite any.
I was describing an NIH-funded study by Cleveland Clinic scientists.
Reclaiming my time. You did not reference. Reclaiming my
published
time.
in USC Medical, which is one of...
The time is mine. I'm reclaiming it. Please ask the witness to stop talking.
You asked me a question.
Reclaiming.
Allow me to answer my question.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like about 10 seconds back.
The time belongs.
You are slandering me incorrectly. You're saying it's dishonest.
Time belongs to the gentlelady from
Florida.
Florida.
Defend myself.
Mr.
Time
Chairman,
belongs to the gentlelady from Florida.
I'd like 15 seconds back.
We will be
Mr.
happy to
Chairman.
give you that.
Thank you so much. You did not cite any study like you are citing here now during that conversation. You referenced no study at all. You simply labeled Jews and Chinese people as a race, and you also said that somehow they managed to avoid a deadly illness that targets other groups for death. You don't see that? You're trying to rewrite history here. A few months ago, Mr. Kennedy, you compared COVID public health policies to barbaric, murderous tactics of Nazi Germany, saying that Jewish people in Nazi Germany had more freedom than Americans facing COVID health restrictions. In hindsight, Mr. Kennedy, do you reject this absurd and deeply hurtful and harmful comparison, or do you still stand by it?
Congressman, what you are saying is a lie.
That you said it.
I did not. I never contained.
Okay.
I never, ever
Mr. Chairman, I'm
compared
happy to
COVID
enter into the record when Mr.
countermeasures.
Kennedy said that. I reclaim my time. In discussing COVID public health measures, you made light of the genocide against Jewish people by saying, and I quote, "Even Hitler's Germany, you could cross the Alps to Switzerland, you could hide in an attic like Anne Frank did." Mr. Kennedy, do you think it was easy for Jewish people to escape systematic slaughter of Nazis, yes or no?
Absolutely not.
Okay, good. Mr. Kennedy, do you think it was just as hard to wear a mask during COVID as it was to hide under floorboards or false walls so you weren't murdered or dragged to a concentration camp? Yes or no?
Excuse me?
That's a question, yes or no?
I didn't hear your question.
Okay. I said, do you think it was just as hard to wear a mask during COVID as it was to hide under floorboards or false walls so you weren't murdered or dragged to a concentration camp?
Of course not. That's
Okay.
ridiculous.
But that's a comparison that you made.
I did
Mr.
not
Kennedy,
make that comparison.
Were the measures taken to contain the spread and fatalities related to COVID in any way at all comparable to the murder of 6 million Jews, yes or no?
Absolutely not.
Okay. Let's be very clear here. There's no legitimate comparison to the Holocaust. It doesn't matter if you're talking about AI, vaccine mandates, or anything else. There is no comparison. And if this were a slip of the tongue, Mr. Kennedy, or a one-off comment, we would all move on. But there's a deeply disturbing pattern. In 2015, you apologized to all those, quote, whom I offended by my use of the word Holocaust to describe the autism epidemic. When discussing efforts to encourage others to get vaccinated for COVID-19, you said Nazis did that in the camps in World War II. They tested vaccines on gypsies and Jews. That was a quote. Like before, you apologized for invoking the Holocaust, saying, quote, "To the extent my remarks caused hurt, I am truly and deeply sorry." These are not real statements of contrition or remorse. They are passive-aggressive non-apologies that blame the listener for reacting to the lie you just spread. I'm deeply saddened that this is a conversation we're having today. I have deep respect for what Mr. Kennedy's family did and still does to make life better for all Americans. But what you are doing now, Mr. Kennedy, and the forces you aligned yourself are reckless, dangerous, and disturbing by echoing dangerous claims such as, quote, "Jews don't really suffer as much as we do," which you said. Your rhetoric creates a climate of mistrust, antagonism, and even hatred or violence against Jewish people. My own children have been the targets of brutal anti-Semitism on social media. You fan those flames and jeopardize their safety. You've marginalized other groups too, like Asian Americans and the LGBTQ+ community. And worse, you don't seem to care or brush it all off to misquotes and misunderstanding. Frankly, it's disgusting. Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Chairman, I have unanimous consent
The
request.
gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for UC.
I ask unanimous consent to introduce into the record a study that Mr. Kennedy just referenced, new insights into genetic susceptibility of COVID-19. The main body said that they investigated genetic susceptibility to COVID-19 by examining DNA polymorphism in ACE2 and TMPRSS2. Those are receptors for COVID in 81,000 human genomes, and they found unique genetic susceptibility across different populations. I have another document that I'd like to ask unanimous consent.
Without objection.
To submit, and this is from the FDA review of efficacy and safety of Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine. This is dated December 10th, 2020, and it shows that the Pfizer trial and the USDA broke down the effectiveness of the vaccine into 7 different racial categories because this was also a concern of theirs, and it would frankly be delinquent not to study the effects across the
But
different
Mr.
races.
Kennedy said it was bioengineered to
Without
target
Time
blacks and
belongs to
Caucasians.
the gentleman from Utah
And
is
spare
recognized for 5
whites,
minutes.
and spare Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese people. That is different
Time
than any
belongs
of
to
those
the
studies
gentleman
looked
from
at.
Utah.
Thank you, claiming my time. Mr. Kennedy, you've had some accusations thrown at you today. I'm going to ask my questions briefly and give you a chance to respond to that at the end of my time here. Ms. Wiley, if I could talk to you. And I know maybe you're busy, with something else there, but do you trust the government to determine what facts and views the American people should be exposed to?
I trust that we have a process whereby we can interrogate what we hear and learn from the government, but certainly I expect the government to share facts and information.
That wasn't my question. I didn't say share facts and information. I said, do you trust the government to determine what facts and views the American people should be exposed to and which ones they should not?
Well, I think I'm struggling with the question because that is not the facts of the case in Missouri.
Simple
in
question.
Missouri versus
I'm not talking
Biden,
about Missouri. I'm not talking
which
about
is
Missouri.
what I was
Hey.
hearing.
I'm not talking about Missouri. This is a very simple question. Do you trust the government to determine what facts and views the American people are exposed to?
I am not aware of any action of the government
Okay,
that
I'm gonna
tells the
take that-
American public what facts they should be exposed
You're not aware of that?
to. No, I am not.
Oh my gosh, where have you lived for the last 3 years?
In the United States of America.
Let me ask you, China suppresses free speech. Is that a good thing?
No, of course not.
Iran, mullahs there suppress free speech. Is that a good thing?
No, of course
Vladimir Putin suppresses. Is that a good thing?
not. No, we all
So
agree
can
we should not suppress free speech.
we agree then that the government government leaders should not suppress free speech? Do we agree with that?
That's a different question. Yes, it is unconstitutional
How
for the
is it
government to pass laws that would abridge free speech. That's the First
or
Amendment.
not pass laws, but to create pressure that would suppress free speech. Vladimir Putin doesn't pass a law.
Yes.
He exerts his force and influence to suppress free speech.
Yes, the case law says that the government cannot coerce private entities.
And we agree that's a bad idea, don't we?
Yes, and I would absolutely agree when
We
Donald
agree
Trump,
then the government
when Donald
shouldn't-
Trump
wait,
threatened social
we-
media companies
Hang on,
with
hang on,
federal
hang on,
regulation
hang on.
shutdown, that was coercion.
That's not my question.
Oh, I know, but I think it was consistent to show
Here's,
that we
here's my
agree.
question for you. We agree the government shouldn't be responsible for restricting views that the American people are exposed to. We agree on that, right? You wouldn't answer it at first,
Oh,
but it's clear that you do agree with that.
That's
Because
a different question.
Okay, so to my question, do you agree with it or not?
I agree that the government should not violate our Constitution.
Do you agree with my question?
Your question is
Should the government
whether or not
determine,
the
this is so simple.
No, it is not so simple.
No, I'm going to ask it
because-
one time, and it is so simple. A 7th grader could understand this question. Should the government be responsible for the views and the facts that the American people are exposed to?
The problem I have is that I don't
Okay,
know of any facts in which the government tells us
I'm
what
going to
to
say that
believe.
you're unable to answer a question, which for me is fairly shocking as an American citizen. Let me ask you now then, having concluded that you're unaware of suppression of free speech in the last several years, what about, for
That's not
example,
actually what I said, but thank you.
do you think it was appropriate for the FBI to pressure private companies to censor and take down posts that the government disagreed with? Was that appropriate? I'll give you an example that you were unaware of. I'm glad you're aware of it now. Was that appropriate for the government to do that?
Sir, the only thing that is appropriate for the government to do is what it is lawfully allowed to do both under the Constitution and the laws of this country,
Which is?
which is to conduct its criminal investigations appropriately to our laws and to our policy.
So they didn't have the ability then to go to these private companies and to say they can't
There are
allow
instances in which, in order to protect the integrity of a criminal prosecution, they may ask, sometimes news agencies and others to
Certainly agree with
withhold.
that. Was that the case
Yeah.
here? Was there any criminal prosecutions involved with these cases? Not that I'm
There
aware
were
of.
criminal investigations are not prosecutions.
Okay, criminal
And also
investigations?
the integrity of criminal.
Were there any criminal investigations regarding these examples?
Which examples are those, sir?
For example, anything regarding the Hunter Biden laptop?
Well, there are lots of things that have been said in public media about Hunter Biden's laptop. There was a criminal investigation, in fact, a plea in that case.
Does it bother you that 51 former intelligence officials made a determination that the Hunter Biden laptop was Russian disinformation, which they admit, by the way, they had no evidence at all that that was true. Zero evidence that that was true. Does that bother you they did that?
What bothers me tremendously is that while there are a lot of things we should be talking about with regard to whether or not the government at times exceeds its authority, that includes whether or not government exceeds its authority when it tries to censor or interfere with research or research institutions, where any White House official such as Donald Trump, actually threatens the full power of the federal government, including the threat to shut down social media because they put a fact-check label on a tweet.
Expired.
Mr. Chairman, I have a unanimous consent request.
Gentlelady from New York is recognized.
I'd like to submit for the record TIP Insights, a New Jersey-based Institute of Policy and Politics poll conducted of over 1,000 adults between August 2nd, August 4th of 2022 showed that 8 in 10 voters, if they were made aware of the Biden laptop, that would have been determinative in changing the outcome of the election. It also demonstrates that 61% of Democrats, including this poll, would have changed their vote. Submitted for the record.
Without objection, thank you. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've been in this Congress 15 years, and I never thought we'd descend to this level of Orwellian dystopia. Suddenly, the tools of the trade are not to get at the truth, but to distract, distort, deflect, and dissemble. To disagree is censorship. To try to correct the facts is to infringe on my right of free speech. Of course, it only works one way. The name of Dr. Fauci has been invoked. I'd love to have him here as a witness to describe his travail in being censored. But of course, with that right-wing censorship comes intimidation and threat and intimations of violence. And a wink-blink that, by the way, violence, can be justified. The violence, for example, here on January 6th has been explicitly excused by some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle as a bunch of tourists who got a little out of hand, a little overexcited. 5 are dead, including my constituent, Capitol Hill police officer, who died the next day from the trauma and shock of that experience. And ironically, talk about free speech and duty, he voted for Donald Trump. But his duty was to be here that day. Often Skolnick. And somehow, my freedom to harm with the words I use is considered further evidence of censorship. But we know words have power. And that's why we take care with the words we use. We have mass killings in America. We buried people recently at Pittsburgh because of their identity. Hate speech has consequences. Distortion of the truth has consequences. It's not censorship to try to correct that record. Vaccination denial would have cost millions of more lives in America. 1.1 million fellow Americans are dead today because of the pandemic. And millions are saved because of a vaccine that was developed in record time, and we ought to be celebrating that, not caviling about it. Protective measures were taken to take down disinformation about vaccines and about the nature of the virus and about protective measures we could take, including masks, including social distancing. It was not big brother government trying to exercise its will on an innocent population. It was public health measures to protect lives. Again, something should be celebrated. But no, there's an opportunity to have a conspiracy theory here. There's an opportunity to make political points. And no matter what you may think, Mr. Kennedy, and I revere your name, you're not here to propound your case for censorship. You are here for cynical reasons to be used politically by that side of the aisle to embarrass the current president of the United States, and you're an enabler in that effort today. And it brings shame on a storied name that I revere. I began my political interest with your father, and it makes me profoundly sad to see where we have descended today in this hearing. I yield the balance of my time to Mr. Goldman.
Thank you, the distinguished gentleman from Virginia. We don't have a lot of time to dig into questions, but I would just note for my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who are former prosecutors, you well know that the opinions of a journalist don't amount to actual evidence of anything, and it is a sign of the desperate attempt to satisfy your conspiracy theories that you're bringing a fringe right
Gentleman's out of
reporter
time.
to provide evidence of for your investigation, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Johnson from Louisiana.
I'm so grateful for that segue from Mr. Golden because we're about to talk about hard evidence here. It's really ironic this hearing is covering the left's censorship of opposing viewpoints, and you've all seen it on display all day long. They've been doing exactly that. They've been trying to bully and defame our witnesses and try to cover up their opinions. They actually began the hearing with a motion to prevent them from testifying. You can't make this stuff up. It's on broad display for everybody. They did the same thing yesterday in the hearing with the IRS whistleblowers. You know why? Because the Democrats are panicked right now. They're panicked because it's impossible to cover up the inescapable conclusions of the last few weeks. Let me give you two of them. First, one, the hard evidence, Mr. Goldman and everybody else, now proves that the Biden family is hopelessly corrupt and has apparently engaged in a long pattern of extortion, bribery, influence peddling, and tax fraud, and staggering abuses of power. And number two, we're highlighting here today that we now know that a growing list of the most important executive branch agencies of the Biden administration are in on it. They've also been corrupted. They've been weaponized to help cover all this up, the first family's crimes. When we summarize all this stuff, it sounds like a premise of a dystopian novel or something, but it's actually happening right now on our watch. This is not conspiracy theories, this is evidence. Our hearing today is to put a spotlight on one more of these incredible avenues of unprecedented corruption and government cover-up. And here again, a federal court has just affirmed all that hard evidence. It proves that the White House, the Department of Justice, and the FBI, among other agencies, threatened and coerced the social media platforms to censor and suppress disfavored viewpoints and conservatives' social media posts online. I'm grateful we have with us today two individuals, Mr. Kennedy and Ms. Harris, who were directly impacted by that censorship, and the third, Mr. Sauer, who we're about to speak with, serving as lead counsel in the landmark lawsuit against the federal government on this issue. Let's talk facts. The American people are not aware of the magnitude of this case, Mr. Sauer, and its profound implications because most of the mainstream media is in on it too, and they're trying to bury the story. In brief, in May of last year, the attorneys general of my state, Louisiana, and the state of Missouri filed suit in U.S. District Court of the Western District of Louisiana. This blatant censorship. They went after the blatant censorship by the Biden White House in 9 of its federal agencies. 2 weeks ago on Independence Day, the district court issued a truly extraordinary 155-page court opinion, a ruling granting the plaintiff's request for preliminary injunction. Mr. Sauer, your lead counsel in that litigation. You referenced some in your opening statement, but let's do it again here because they don't seem to be paying attention. Can you give a summary again of some of the key components of that opinion and the basis for it? I know you mentioned there were 82 pages of detailed factual findings, right?
That is correct. 82 pages, 577 citations of the record evidence. That evidence is drawn from about 20,000 pages of the government's own communications with social media platforms and 6 full-length depositions of senior federal officials with firsthand knowledge of federal censorship practices.
It's absolutely staggering. And now they've tried to bury this and say, well, the Fifth Circuit entered a temporary administrative stay. They granted an expedited briefing and oral argument, however, for August 10th. What's the impact of that? Isn't that routine practice in the Fifth Circuit?
That's a direct quote from the recent Fifth Circuit decision, N. Ray Abbott, which is cited in my written testimony. It's legally incorrect, clearly legally incorrect to describe them as vacating the injunction, which has happened multiple times.
They either don't know the law or, I don't know, they're trying to obscure the facts. That's a theme around here. The White House and the fellow Democrats disputed almost none of the factual findings in the court. Isn't that right?
So far, we've had 2 emergency stay motions from the Department of Justice, one in the district court, one in the Court of Appeals. And what really struck me in reading those is they just don't dispute those 82 pages of factual findings. Almost none of them are directly disputed in what they've filed so far.
So at the very beginning of this lengthy opinion, the court explains the staggering scope of the government censorship uncovered here. At page 2, the court explains, quote, if the allegations made by the plaintiffs are true, the present case arguably involves the most massive attack on free speech in United States history. The court called it dystopian, Orwellian. How broad has this attack been? How many Americans have been censored, do you think?
There's judicial findings again and again in the opinion of millions of American voices silenced by these efforts.
And it had profound impacts. We know, we just saw the poll and the data that's been entered here, facts, not conjecture, that it probably changed the outcome of the election. The court noted that they suppressed, among other topics, the Hunter Biden laptop story. And the court noted, not you, not me, not Republicans, that millions of Americans were not exposed to that story. Had they been, we know they might have voted differently. We'll never be able to unwind history, but wow, I mean, the profound impacts. What are some of the other categories of speech that the government suppressed with its unconstitutional scheme?
Well, the court made findings on that. I just quote them: opposition to COVID-19 vaccines, opposition to COVID-19 masking and lockdowns, the lab leak theory of COVID-19, opposition to President Biden's policies, statements that the Hunter Biden laptop story was true, opposition to the policies of government officials in power. All were suppressed. And that's just some examples, many other examples in the court's findings and in the discovery in the case.
I so wish I weren't out of time. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Allred from Texas for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield my time to Ms. Plaskett.
I thank the gentleman from Texas. Mr. Kennedy's and others here are claiming that they've been censored, but they actually have a huge megaphone. The rules that my colleague tried to bring up are rules that the Republicans made at the beginning of this Congress. They did not allow the Democrats to be part of that. And one of those rules was that if information or testimony might potentially defame an individual, that we would go in executive session. No one was trying to stop him from testifying, but not to give him the megaphone that this group has allowed him to have. I also note, in terms of censorship, that the far-right media has already issued articles about me playing the race card. The race card is something that's often used against Black people for bringing up when they see race hatred being propagated against them. And it's a means to try and keep us quiet and keep us in our place. Oh, you're playing the race card by bringing up what is obvious in our lives, what is obviously happening, race. And so you can keep saying I'm race baiting and try and censor me, but I'm going to continue to tell the truth. I want to be abundantly clear about what else is happening in this room. The MAGA Republicans are trying to scare social media companies into not taking down blatantly false information in the lead up to our 2024 presidential election. Chair Jordan knows, as we do, that when conspiracy theories succeed, so does Donald Trump. Russia interfered in our 2016 election, they attempted in our 2020, and they're going to try to interfere in the 2024 presidential election. We note that Russian trolls sought to suppress the Black vote by unleashing a torrent of social media posts designed to stoke racial tensions and spread incorrect voting information. In 2021, our national intelligence agencies found that proactive information sharing between the government and social media companies facilitated the expeditious review and, in many cases, removal of social media accounts covertly operated by Russia and Iran. Ms. Wiley, if the government is not able to proactively share information with social media companies in 2024, what is likely to have be the ramifications? And I'd ask that you make your answer as succinct as possible because there's a lot of information I need.
I will just quote one thing. Mr. Prigozhin, who's been in the news of late, actually said explicitly and openly that they would continue to try to spread mis and disinformation into the United States and interfere with our elections.
Thank you. They know that Russian interference, that is, the MAGA Republicans know that Trump benefits when Russia interferes. The super PAC that supports, the same super PAC that supports Mr. Kennedy and has raised significant funds on his behalf is run by a man named Jason Bowles. Here's Jason Bowles' Twitter profile, as you can see up on the screen. Jason Bowles isn't just a MAGA supporter, he also ran the super PAC for MAGA Republicans Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, George Santos, and in 2022, he supported Herschel Walker. So the person behind Mr. Kennedy's super PAC is an individual who personally and professionally wants the Republican Party to succeed. Yet, Mr. Kennedy is running as a Democrat. Ms. Wiley, will it benefit Mr. Kennedy as well as the other individuals that are supported by the super PAC if social media companies are less able to detect and, if needed, if they determine that it's needed, to remove Russian covert information designed to suppress votes in this country?
It is possible.
Thank you. I yield back.
Can I yield the remainder of the time?
Gentlelady yields back. I now recognize Mr. Stubbe from Florida for his 5 minutes.
Mr. Kennedy, do you want to respond to that? Can you do that quickly?
Yeah, I've never heard of Mr. Bowles, and I've never heard of that super PAC. This is typical of the accusations against me at this hearing. They are baseless, every single one. I've been subjected to a parade of defamations. If I believe those things about myself, I wouldn't want to hear me either, and want to gag me and lock me in a room somewhere. But none of those are true, and they were all of this parade of accusations and defamations were made against me in a way that was calculated to make sure that I could not respond to any of them. Every one of them I'd like to respond to, but I was not allowed to.
To further the disinformation going on, Ms. Wiley, in response to a question, you stated that the decision in Missouri v. Biden was vacated by the appellate court. Is that correct?
I did, and I want to correct that because Mr. Sauer is right. The appropriate word is stayed.
Administratively stayed. So it hasn't been vacated
Stayed.
or dismissed like Mrs. Sanchez
It's
said.
stayed, which means it cannot be implemented right now.
Okay, because I didn't want us to censor your disinformation that you stated as a factual assertion earlier. So
I did misspeak, and I apologize.
Thank you for clarifying that for us. And to talk about more evidence about, I think it's interesting. There's a lot in this opinion, and I have limited time, but I think illustrating some of the actions that the Biden administration took to censor speech is very important. I'm going to read specifically from the opinion. Explicit threats are an obvious form of coercion, but not all coercion needs be explicit. I'm on page 97 of the opinion. The following illustrative specific actions by defendants are examples of coercion exercised by the White House defendants. A, cannot stress the degree to which this needs to be resolved immediately. Please remove this count immediately. Sounds like a directive from the White House to me to social media companies. Accuse Facebook of causing political violence by failing to censor false COVID-19 claims. F, this is exactly why I want to know what reduction actually looks like. If reduction means pumping our most vaccine-hesitant audience with Tucker Carlson saying it does not work, then I'm not sure it's reduction, implying that they're reducing the information on that. Questioning how the Tucker Carlson video had been demoted since there were 40,000 shares. Wanting to know why Alex Berenson had not been kicked off Twitter because Berenson was the epicenter of disinformation and radiated outward to the persuadable public. And I'm just skipping through here. I'm not even going through all these. Flatteringly stated, not to sound like a broken record, but how much content is being demoted and how effective are you at mitigating reach and how quickly? Flattery told Facebook, are you guys effing serious? I want an answer on what happened here and I want it today. Sounds like a pretty explicit threat to me. Letter M, White House Press Secretary Psaki stated, and I quote, we are in regular touch with these social media platforms, and those engagements typically happen through members of our senior staff, but also members of our COVID-19 team. We're flagging problematic posts for Facebook that spread disinformation. Psaki also stated, one of the White House asks of social media companies was to create a robust enforcement strategy. Oh, Psaki stated on the February 1st, 2022 White House press conference that the White House wanted every social media platform to do more to call out misinformation and disinformation and to uplift accurate information. Another one, hey folks, wanted to flag the below tweet and I'm wondering if we can get moving on the process of having it removed ASAP. Sounds like a pretty explicit demand from the White House to me. Again, quoting the opinion. These actions are just a few examples of the unrelenting pressure the defendants exerted against social media companies. This court finds the above examples demonstrate that plaintiffs can likely prove the White House defendants engaged in coercion to induce social media companies to suppress free speech. Mr. Sauer, in the limited time that I have, can you just comment further on these are just some of the highlights that are in the opinion and illustrate to us all of the evidence of the White House censoring the American public and working with social media companies to accomplish that.
It's very telling that the judicial findings are quite specific on the specific threats. So there's several ways you can violate the First Amendment if you're a government official. One is coercion, one is significant encouragement, one is joint participation, where you've insinuated yourselves into private decision-making. The court found all of those present here. And with respect to those White House communications, there's a series of specific judicial findings that these statements were threatening. They were threatening adverse legal consequences. There's multiple findings, for example, that White House spokesperson Psaki's public statements explicitly linked the threat of adverse legal consequences to the White House's demands for censorship, which we didn't know at the time, but now know were being very aggressively peppered on the social media platforms while she was making those public statements. So you have public statements from the White House. Also, White House Communications Director Bedingfield, there's a very specific judicial finding on that. Threatening adverse legal consequences in public if there's not greater censorship. And in private, you've got Rob Flaherty, Andy Slavitt, other White House officials saying, take this down, do more to take down borderline content.
Time of the gentleman has expired.
Mr. Chairman, I have unanimous consent request.
Gentleman from Louisiana.
There's a lot of talk about this preliminary injunction, so I'd like to enter into the record a 155-page court opinion, the memorandum ruling on a request for preliminary injunction in the matter of State of Missouri and Louisiana v. Biden from the U.S. District Court, Western District, Louisiana, Monroe Division, and also the Fifth Circuit's administrative stay, which does not address the merits. I yield back.
Without objection.
Mr. Chair, I'd like unanimous consent to enter into the record an article that states RFK Jr. Super PAC has deep ties to Marjorie Taylor Greene, George Santos, which discusses the Super PAC titled Heal the Divide, which states that only Robert F. Kennedy Jr. can unite the nation and start healing America, and also discusses Mr. Kennedy's discussions with Mr. Trump about working in his administration.
Without objection, the chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Texas, I believe is that the cue?
Thank you.
Ms. Garcia, you recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I live in Houston, but I was born and raised in rural South Texas. And shamefully, rural South Texas and all of rural Texas has been utterly devastated by COVID-19. In fact, only 56% of rural Americans are fully vaccinated versus almost 70% of their urban counterparts. And we know that being unvaccinated makes you up to 17 times more likely to die of COVID compared to people who are vaccinated and boosted. A recent study found that nearly 2,000 lives could have been saved in Texas if it had reached the vaccination levels of places like Vermont or Connecticut. However, today, despite the horrific COVID-19 tragedies, and thank you for describing those refrigerated morgues, if you will, because that was horrible to even see, but I'm sure there are some deniers, just like that deny the climate that even happened. But these tragedies have also plagued rural South Texas and families all around the country, but yet we give a platform to one of the biggest spreaders of anti-vaccine propaganda in the country. He has claimed that vaccines have caused widespread death. They have not. He has claimed that vaccines are unsafe for pregnant people. They are not. He has claimed that vaccines cause autism. They do not. He has even suggested that vaccines implant government-controlled microchips into patients. They do not. As crazy as Mr. Kennedy's theories are, he has been able to effectively spread false medical information throughout our communities due to his prestigious family's name, his deep pockets, and his websites that publish patently false health and medical information. By inviting him here today, extreme MAGA Republicans elevate a man who tells others that vaccines aren't safe, but vaccines his own children for protection. And it was noted earlier, even asked guests to his party to be vaccinated. 3 billion lives were saved by the COVID-19 vaccine. And if anti-vaccine advocates like Mr. Kennedy did not continuously flood our communities with false health and medical information, more lives could have been saved. Ms. Wiley, thank you for your opening remarks, because that was the reality that New York and so many communities across the country faced. We know that sensational false information spreads much faster than accurate information. From your personal experience, is that true?
It is true, and actually one of the ways that the social media companies, which are the places where the rules are determined, and I think it's important when we keep talking about censorship that they have the power and the legal right to decide what content is on their site, and we're talking about their policies here and their enforcement or failure to enforce them. We've actually raised alarm bells at the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights about the fact that they have not sufficiently enforced their own policies and that this has led to harm, very dangerous harm, which we've talked about. But I just want to point this out as well. The social media companies actually use algorithms to elevate content that it finds draws users. And that's why there is research that shows, far from suppressing right-wing and extremist speech, that actually the algorithms used by social media has elevated them. And that's true from the New York Stern School that has a study out from 2021. That testimony, I think, has occurred in Congress. But even Twitter's own analytics shows that it has elevated conservative speech, which, by the way, that shows, and that research shows that while we're sitting here talking about this as if there is somehow a targeting of viewpoint, it's actually been about targeting whether or not the content is consistent with the policies of the platforms that they themselves set.
So this hearing really is literally putting even more lives at risk for elevating all these, what I think are crazy theories, because as long as all this anti-vaccine theories continue to spread, it makes people not only question the vaccine, but other vaccines. Wouldn't you agree?
I would, and I also want to say it also occurs in our democracy in terms of voting. Mis and disinformation about whether or not voting laws are being violated and whether individuals are violating them have led to death threats. That is also in violation of the social media policy.
The gentlelady has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Wyoming, Ms. Hagan, for 5 minutes.
I got a death threat after the last weaponization hearing.
Time belongs to the gentlelady from Wyoming.
I want to thank you, Mr. Sauer, Ms. Morris, and Mr. Kennedy, for your courage, for your willingness to be the tip of the spear to protect all of our First Amendment rights. Mr. Sauer, I don't know if you watched the testimony from Christopher Wray last week, but he testified and admitted that the FBI was continuing to meet regularly with social media companies up until the very moment that the injunction was issued by the district court judge. What that tells me is they're not stopping. They're going to continue to try to further the censorship industrial complex as long as they can, and will continue to attempt to violate our First Amendment rights. We all must be vigilant. Ms. Morris, I want to focus on you today. I don't think that we've talked enough about the freedom of the press, but it's also included in the First Amendment and is as important as any other First Amendment right that we have. I want to thank you for your testimony today, and we all know that the First Amendment is a core fundamental right. Within its protection of the protection of the free press against infringement by the government. Free press has been an institution in this nation which dates back to even before America existed. Americans have always relied on the media to remain informed about the workings of their government and events in the world. This is why the press is often referred to as the fourth branch, using the rights secured by the Constitution as a fourth check on the three branches of government. Ms. Morris, before a majority presidential election, you were prepared to release a factual report about one of the candidates. One would think that the information in your report would be of interest to the American people to understand the integrity of the candidates who are asking for their support and their trust. The facts have been laid out by you and this committee of how the FBI worked with social media to alter their perception of what your story was and to change their policies to censor it. Ms. Morris, your story was obviously groundbreaking news. And as we have learned and uncovered additional information over the intervening 2 years, I can say with confidence that what has been going on with the Biden family is absolutely horrific and undermines the very foundation of our country and the integrity of the people in the highest elected and appointed offices in this country. But it's now, we know that you were correct in what you were going to be reporting. Has there been any estimates, or do you have any general idea of how many people were denied access to your story because of the government censorship?
So there are polls about that. The MRC, Media Research Center, did a poll about, it said 45% of Biden voters were not aware of the story. But I think it also is an impossible question to answer, because the thing about the censorship was not only that it was, deleted or whatever from Twitter, but also it casted an aspersion on the reporting, on me, that was literally made up. It was made up. And there's a subset of this country where, despite the New York Times, the Washington Post, like literally fill in the blank, like liberal news legacy outlet that they all trust, they just reflexively think laptop from hell, fake, Russia, whatever. And so the effect of that can't be measured, because these people who are spies, who the country looks at as the ultimate authority of truth, came out and said that this was, there was something wrong with it, so you can't measure the impact of that.
And so going back to the legacy media, the Oversight Committee had a very explosive hearing yesterday with whistleblowers from the IRS. Some of our legacy media outlets did not cover the hearing, but they did talk about Taco Tuesday, and they talked about other things that seemed to be of great interest to them, but not the fact that we are uncovering an enormous amount of corruption at the very highest levels in our government. While you didn't know about the FBI's efforts at the time, I would assume that between the Twitter files and what we've uncovered in the Missouri versus Biden case, you now know the role that the FBI played in censoring your work. Do you think the FBI tried to ensure that the American people didn't hear the story in order to change the outcome of the election in 2020?
I don't know how to answer that question, because I'm not in their head. I don't know, the reason why. I don't have a head count of how many Biden voters work at the FBI. I can't assign a motive to them. I can just tell you what happened and what we've learned in the 2 years since this blatant, in-your-face censorship event.
But we do know that the American public were not told the truth about the Hunter Biden laptop and Joe Biden's involvement with his dealings, foreign dealings.
Well, that's it, and that's what pertains to my work and my experience.
Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from... the chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Kamick. My microphone is broken. Oh, your microphone's broken. Maybe you slide over.
Yeah. Sorry, the microphone is broken. Oh, wait, that might work. Okay. Sorry, this microphone is broken. Want to thank all our witnesses for being in front of us here today. I know that this has not been an easy couple of hours, but I appreciate your endurance. I'll start with you, Ms. Wiley. 5 days ago, Democrat Representative Pramila Jayapal stated that she has been, quote, fighting to make it clear that Israel is a racist state. Yes or no, do you believe that statement to be anti-Semitic?
I believe that there is a distinction between any
just a yes or
conversation
no.
about a government versus a group of people.
So do you believe that each of my Democratic colleagues should publicly denounce her comments?
Well,
and not continue to give her a platform to make statements like Israel is a racist nation? Because essentially that is what is happening here. We are 100% trying to censor one gentleman because one side doesn't agree with his comments. So in a weaponization hearing about censorship,
the left is trying to censor, which I think is absolutely crazy. And I have to bring this up, and since the door was opened, you know, I'm deeply concerned about the fact that there were FEC reports brought up. Mr. Kennedy, you acknowledged that you don't know where those came from. You said that you have no affiliation with those, that PAC, that super PAC, I believe. The ranking member said she was deeply concerned about the affiliation, and we seem to have a guilty by association theme going on here. And so I just have to state for the record that I myself am deeply concerned about the affiliation of the convicted sex trafficker, Jeffrey Epstein, of which the ranking member took campaign donation money from. So I think that's the beauty of the First Amendment, is that we have a right to say what we want to say, but we also have the right to be offended. So I just wanted to point that out, you know, glass houses and all. Our Democrat colleague, Mr. Lynch, opened up the door of what does the impact of the continued narrative of weaponization have on the general public? And I think that's really important, because what we have seen in the last couple of weeks is irrefutable evidence of the fact that the FBI has not only been systematically working to censor American speech, but they have been facilitating it, and in some cases at the behest of foreign governments. A weaponization report proved that there was a direct connection between the Ukrainian SBU, in which that intelligence service was sending spreadsheets of thousands of posts, in some cases posts that were belonging to the United States State Department. And because we know that the Ukrainian SBU is rife with double agents, the FBI wasn't even vetting the posts. They were simply sending them direct to the social media companies saying, please take these down. So now we have an FBI that is not just saying that they're going to fight foreign interference, they're facilitating it. At one point even suggesting that they put forward a 24/7 channel where the FBI takes requests from a foreign government and filters it right to the social media company to have those posts taken down. And it was across the board, anti-Ukraine, pro-Ukraine. That right there proves that they weren't vetting the posts. That's a problem. We've established clearly with hard evidence that there is in fact a weaponization of the federal government against the American people, and every single day that we do not acknowledge it is a bad day in America. The pillars of our constitutional republic, not democracy, are being taken down bit by bit because the press is being told they can't ask the tough questions. Ms. Morris, you have probably received threats, you have been censored, you have been silenced. Mr. Sauer, you have been before us many times, and you have expressed the pushback, the threats that you have received. Mr. Kennedy, I can't imagine what you receive on a daily basis from both the left and the right. So I'm going to go to our Democratic colleague, Mr. Lynch, and ask the question, what impact does the continued narrative of weaponization have on the general public? I know he framed this in a way to make a point that it is somehow negative to ask the tough questions, but I'm going to ask our three witnesses here. What are the ramifications if we don't talk about it, if we don't expose it? And I only have 25 seconds, so Mr. Sauer, take it away.
If federal censorship is not stood up to aggressively, it will expand to every corner of online discourse.
Ms. Morris.
It's just this, I can't even believe this is a conversation. Like, this is not controversial or taboo. We live in the United States of America, and you have the right to say whatever you want, to print whatever you want, and to read whatever you want.
Mr. Kennedy.
A government that can censor its critics has license for every atrocity. It is the beginning of totalitarianism. There's never been a time in history when we look back and the guys who were censoring people were the good guys. All of us grew up reading Arthur Koestler, Robert Heinlein, Aldous Huxley, George Orwell, and they were all saying the same thing. Once you start censoring, you're on your way to dystopia and totalitarianism.
And I know my time has expired, but Mr. Sauer, you said earlier, censorship is about power. Censorship is about control. And the entire progressive leftist agenda is about nothing more than dependency and control. That is why this is so important. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Chair, before that, I have a document I'd like to enter into the record, a Washington Post article of July 23rd, which lists the misstatements of facts in the preliminary injunction in the Missouri v. Biden case that we've been talking about.
From what paper? What publication?
I said the Washington Post.
Okay.
Thank
Without
you.
objection.
Mm-hmm.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Sauer, welcome back to the committee. It's great to see you again. You're becoming a mainstay on the committee, and I do hope that you continue to update us on your case now that it has been stayed and will not be implemented as it goes through the appeals process. I'd like to quickly play a short video, if we could.
COVID-19 is targeted to attack Caucasians and black people. The people who are most immune are Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese.
Mr. Kennedy, I have a simple question for you. As an early victim of COVID, I actually got it March 10th, 2020. And my question to you is whether you think I should be worried about my genetics as an Ashkenazi Jew because I did contract COVID.
No, not at all. And that statement that you saw there is a truncated version of a larger statement.
No, I understand. You issued a clarification.
Where I was describing, I was
understand.
describing.
Hold on. I had a simple question. You're now going on and reclaiming my time. Because what I really want to talk about here is evidence. Evidence, evidence, evidence. Mr. Johnson was so eager to talk about what he called the hard evidence, and yet all we heard again was him repeating allegations without identifying any evidence. You can repeat all of these allegations as much as you want, but it doesn't make them true.
Well, gentlemen,
you are not witnesses. I don't have enough time, unfortunately. You are not witnesses to any of this conduct, and just because you say it over and over, it doesn't make it so. And if we're talking about censorship here, which I believe is presumably the reason why Mr. Kennedy is here, the tweet that you've identified was never taken down. Whatever the government may have tried to do, and I don't agree that it tried to do what you said it did, it wasn't taken down. So how can the government actually censor anyone if there's enough freedom within the companies they're talking to that they reject whatever request that the government makes? I want to focus now, Ms. Morris, on the laptop. There's been a lot of talk about the laptop being real, and that is true. There was a laptop, it's a computer, keyboard, screen. It is real, but you never got a laptop before you wrote that story, did you?
That's correct.
You got a hard drive.
Hard drive.
And you received that hard drive from Rudy Giuliani, right?
Yep.
Okay. Who had been openly associating with an agent of Russian intelligence in the months leading up to your story. You agree with that, right?
I guess.
Now, did you do a forensic examination of that hard drive before you printed your story?
We had tech people in the Post looking at it, yes.
That's a forensic analysis?
No, not.
I highly doubt the New York Post has the ability to do a forensic analysis of a hard drive. Okay. Ms. Morris, were you the primary drafter of this article?
Yes.
Bruce Golding was not the primary author?
No.
Drafter?
No.
Did he help with the article?
Yes.
And then isn't it true that he decided to withdraw his name from the byline because of concerns that he had?
I wasn't involved with that.
Well, isn't it true, whether you were involved in it or not?
I don't know the details.
But he did withdraw his name from the byline.
His name was not published.
Right. Well, I'd like to introduce for the record an article in the New York Times that says, the first line is, New York Post front page article about Hunter Biden was written mostly by a staff reporter who refused to put his name on it, two Post employees said. Now, I would note, you also said that this article was determinative of the election, but there was a pause for 24 hours, and there was a tremendous controversy. And there is no doubt that this article received far more attention because of the controversy than it would if it had ever been published without any controversy. And it is odd to hear my colleagues and Ms. Morris talk about their somehow expert knowledge about whether it affected the election, because we're not hearing a lot about Jim Comey, although one of my colleagues did say that he interfered in the 2016 election, and that is correct. He interfered on behalf of Donald Trump against Hillary Clinton by unnecessarily announcing an investigation 6 days before. The majority would like us to believe that there's some broad government conspiracy, but in reality, this government is playing by the book. That is why Joe Biden's Justice Department has allowed a Trump-appointed U.S. attorney to continue his investigation of the president's son, which is in direct contrast to what the former president did by weaponizing the Justice Department. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes himself. Hard evidence. Mr. Johnson said that we're not only witnesses to censorship, we were victims. The Republican website on the House Judiciary Committee posted this story, and it was limited where it could go. You got to. They exercise censorship of the House Judiciary Republican account, for goodness sake. Ms. Wiley, you were a lawyer for the ACLU?
I was.
Mr. Kennedy, I remember when the ACLU defended they were the champions of the First Amendment. You remember that? You remember that, ACLU?
I remember when the ACLU represented Nazis who they were appalled by.
Appalled, disgusted by, and yet they would defend the crazy things they said, right? That's how much the First Amendment meant to them, right?
Exactly.
I want to go back to where Mr. Stubbe was. I want to talk about this hard evidence that Mr. Goldman says doesn't exist. I want to read from the facts. This is what the White House was saying. I want to go to just 3 statements. One, cannot stress this is statements from the Biden White House to social media, cannot stress the degree to which this needs to be resolved immediately. Please remove this account immediately. Same kind of thing they put on yours, remove ASAP. But here's the better one. Here's the better one. Mr. Flaherty, who ran this COVID operation misinformation concept at the White House, Mr. Flaherty said this, not to sound like a broken record, how much content is being demoted and how effective are you at mitigating reach and how quickly? And we should just translate that because this is real simple. How much censorship are you doing How much censorship are you doing and how quickly are you doing it? But I think the kicker is what Jen Psaki, the press secretary, said back in 2021. Look at this. Now think about this. The press secretary, we're talking about the White House, considered the center of freedom on the planet. The press secretary in the press room says this, we are in regular touch with these social media platforms, and those engagements typically happen through members of our senior staff, but also members of our COVID-19 team. We're flagging problematic posts for Facebook that spread disinformation, their definition, of course. Psaki also stated one of the White House asks was of social media companies to create a robust enforcement strategy. So you got the press secretary in the press room in the White House saying we're going to limit the press. Now that is frightening. That is frightening. And Ms. Wiley from the ACLU, lawyer with the ACLU, thinks that's somehow appropriate. We know it's not. And their number one target, Mr. Kennedy, was you, a Democrat, their primary opponent. I find that amazing. And I would like any thoughts you may have on, because here's the scary thing, and Dennis and I had this conversation a while back. If you don't have a robust First Amendment, if you try to restrict what the people say and what the press reports, that is a scary place to go. Because if you can't have debate and work out our differences, like you said in your amazing opening statement, let's work together, let's figure this out. But if you can't have that robust debate and figure things out, the alternative is scary. And that's exactly where we're headed. And I would encourage everyone to read Mr. Kennedy's written statement. I read it this morning. Amazing. He walks through the history here. That is what's at stake, and that's why what you're doing, whether we agree with what you say or not, and I disagree with what you said last week, what they played. I think a lot of people did. You've clarified it, but it's about protecting the Constitution and the First Amendment. I'll give you the last minute and a half, Mr. Kennedy.
Well, what I would say is that the founders and the framers of our Constitution knew that democracy was a very inefficient system, that it had all of these built-in inefficiencies and difficulties. They said that they felt that it would give us the one thing that would give us an advantage over totalitarian systems was this capacity for the free flow of information and a complete lack of control of debate. so that ideas that would eventually mature into policies would be annealed in a furnace of debate and then rise through the marketplace of ideas rather than being dictated from above. And that's what would give the energy, the vibrancy, the vigor to democracy. When they invented this democracy, we were the first one in the modern era in 1780. By 1865, 5 other nations had imitated us. Today, it's 190 nations based upon our system. We are supposed to be the exemplary democracy, and the corner foundation stone of our system is freedom of speech. All of the other freedoms depend on it. If we lose that, not only do we lose our democracy in this country, but the entire world loses us as an example.
Exactly. I couldn't have said it better. Now I recognize the gentleman from Kentucky.
Mr. Chairman, I have a unanimous consent request.
Gentleman, state a request.
Ask for unanimous consent to enter the record an article by the New York Times on July the 20th, 2023. New York Post published Hunter Biden report amid newsroom doubts. Ask for unanimous consent.
You can, without objection.
Thank you.
Some things amaze me. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized, and this will be our last line of questioning.
One of the immutable and undeniable tenets of immunology is natural immunity. But for 2 years, it was denied. It wasn't even just denied, it was censored. Mr. Sauer, I noticed in the court ruling, in the case that you worked on, that they said that, the court said that Facebook reported to the White House that it labeled and demoted posts suggesting natural immunity to a COVID-19 infection is superior to vaccine immunity. Is that true? Was that kind of censorship going on?
Yes, that kind of censorship was going on, and there were direct communications between the platforms and federal officials about natural immunity specifically that I think you've correctly quoted.
And thanks to the Twitter files, we found out that the former FDA director who was on the board of Pfizer, Dr. Scott Gottlieb, wrote on August 27th, 2021, to Twitter executive Todd O'Boyle, who, by the way, was kind of one of the go-to people for the White House also to coordinate with when they wanted something suppressed, requested Twitter take action against a post about natural immunity. You know what's amazing to me is Scott Gottlieb, who works for Pfizer, who's a former FDA director, went to Twitter the day I got censored on natural immunity, my post, a congressional post. Now, the other side said, well, your tweet's still up, your post is still up. What do you mean you're getting censored? What they did is they labeled it and they denied anybody's ability to actually comment on it, and they deboosted it. So I simply said natural immunity is better than vaccine immunity. We had studies showing that. They took it, they censored it. So the next day I tried it again with a reference to Bloomberg, hardly a right-wing outlet or conspiracy generator, and they censored that one as well. This is astounding to me. Mr. Kennedy, can you talk about the censorship, the effort of the White House and pharma to suppress the acknowledgement of natural immunity and why they might have been doing that?
Well, again, there was an effort to suppress information, not, in fact, if you read the Twitter files and the email correspondence between Facebook and the White House, there was an acknowledgement that they were being asked and they were complying with censoring information that everybody knew to be true or highly likely to be true. The purpose, and in fact, the term misinformation did not denote falsehood or veracity. Rather, it was a euphemism for any information that departed from government orthodoxies. And it is very dangerous. And, you know, the congressman a minute ago said 1 million people have died because of misinformation about vaccines in this country. But in fact, our country had one of the highest vaccination rates in the world and the worst health outcomes. We have 4.2% of the global population. We had 16% of the COVID deaths. Blacks in Haiti with a 1% vaccination rate were dying at a rate of 15 per million population. And same in Nigeria, had a 1.3 vaccination rate. They were dying at 1 in 14 per million population, 14 per million population. In our country, blacks were dying at 3,000 per million population, 200 times the death rates in other countries. And this holds throughout the world. We needed information. We should have all been sharing information openly and talking to the 15 million doctors through the internet who were treating patients on the front line all over the world and channeling the best therapies, the most successful treatments, so that we could all figure it out. This is not a time in a pandemic I'll just say this one thing. Trusting the experts is not a function of science. It's not a function of democracy. It's a function of religion and totalitarianism, and it does not make for a healthier population.
Let me ask you this. You referenced your father and your uncle and the party that they were in. What has happened to your party with respect to the First Amendment? Would they recognize the position now?
I think, listen, I'm a Democrat, and I believe in all if you went through a checklist of all of the things that my father believed in, that he fought for, that my uncle believed in and fought for, I would check every box. I feel my party has departed from some of those core values, and one of the reasons that I want to run for president is to reclaim my party for those. But it's got to, listen, this is not a partisan issue. The First Amendment, it just seems crazy to me that anybody thinks that it's okay to censor, and there's a lot of information that I don't like. There's hateful information, but as the chairman was saying, in 1977, the ACLU went out and supported Nazis who were walking through a Jewish neighborhood in Skokie, Illinois. And they said, that's important. We hate what they're saying. We're repulsed by it. But we cannot survive as a democracy if we are not ready to die for the right for even people who are appalling to speak. The democracy won't work. Unfortunately, there's no other way to control it but through the First Amendment and free speech.
Amen, and thank you for those comments.
Time the gentleman has expired. Ranking Mayor, I have one other question I could ask, but I would first give you a chance to ask the question if you had. I just have one quick question for Mr. Kennedy. But I want to be fair. If you got an extra question you want to ask Ms. Wiley or any of the witnesses, I'll turn to you first.
Wasn't prepared for that, so
Well,
if
I'm
you
sorry.
just give me a second.
I thought I was going to get 15 seconds from Mr. Massey, but we weren't able to do that.
Sure. Thank you, sir. I did want to ask Ms. Wiley regarding, we had a discussion and it was brought up by one of the witnesses related to the website Gab. And if you could tell us, it seems to me that while Mr. Kennedy is here, he claims to have been censored, but in reality, his group Children's Health Defense has been allowed to say whatever they want on Gab. Can you share what Gab is?
Gab is an online community that it explicitly states that it wants to create a Christian political economy, and it is a space where researchers have identified a massive influx of extremist and also explicitly anti-Semitic engagement and behavior. Not saying that's about everyone who participates, but that has been documented. And as I stated earlier, the convicted murderer in the Tree of Life massacre actually spent a lot of time on that, and it was deplatformed because it was not adhering to some of the social media policies about identifying that kind of speech.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Actually, I'm going to let Mr. Johnson have our 1 minute here, but I think he wants to wait for Mr. Kennedy to.
Well, I can be asking of Mr. Sauer.
Okay.
I'm sorry that Mr. Goldman left because we talked a lot about evidence. Isn't it true in your litigation, Missouri v. Biden, that Elvis Chan, who was one of the FBI agents in charge of the FBI online censorship program, testified under oath in the litigation, and the court noted it in the opinion, that he had a 50% success rate. In other words, when the FBI brought to the social media platforms content or posts that they said was, disfavored speech for whatever reason, 50% of it was taken down. Isn't that true?
That's correct.
And is there any other glaring piece of evidence that Mr. Goldman might have missed in his review of that outcome? If we've got a second or two here.
There's so much evidence, I couldn't possibly summarize it all. 82 pages of factual findings, tens of thousands of pages of emails and other documents, 6 full-length depositions. And, I just quote what the U.S. Department of Justice attorney said at oral argument in front of Judge Doty on May 26. He said, "How can I be sure that this won't happen again?" And she answered, "It's not the government's position that this will never happen again."
To be fair, I'm out of time. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. We appreciate the work you're doing to defend the First Amendment, and thank you for just very compelling answers and compelling testimony and the work you've done and how important this is for the country. I mean, if we don't have a First Amendment, it's just, I'm frightened by where we go.
May I, Mr. Chairman?
You may not, you may not.
I just
Mr.
want to
Chair,
respond.
Mr. Chair, the time is out, we're done.
I haven't adjourned the hearing, and I don't think you're the chair.
Mr. Chair,
Chairman's discretion.
I
We're gonna
know
let
it's
Mr.
your
Kennedy-
discretion,
We're going to
but
let Mr. Kennedy.
he has had so much additional time.
Well, I think everyone's had
Why?
additional time.
No,
and we're gonna
why?
get-
Why are you doing that specifically for him?
Because
I
we
just
don't,
want
as
to
opposed to other
explain
people. I'm sure the witness,
super PAC.
I'm sure the
on
Democratic
other
witness will be
places.
as short as he possibly can.
No. Are you going to allow our witness to just give another piece?
No, let him address the defamatory comment that was made
address-
about him. That's untrue.
That was not defamatory. That is a legal definition that was not met.
I want to acknowledge information about the super PAC that you mentioned.
Go ahead.
I've just been told that that super PAC is connected to somebody that we have a connection to. It's not a super PAC that I've endorsed, and it's not one, as I said, that I've ever heard of.
Thank the gentleman for that statement, and I thank you for your testimony. The committee is now adjourned.